join.
Okay, so I'm going to call us to order. Today is Tuesday, January 5th. This is a special workshop for the Board of Education. And we have a roll call.
Yes, Student Board Member Corzo Clark. Is he here? I can't see him.
He's not here. I think he's on his way.
Thanks. Okay, I'll come back to him. Student Board Member Mala.
Here.
Trustee Boyd.
Here, sorry, I couldn't find the mute.
Thank you. Trustee Davidson.
Here.
Trustee Duran.
Here, and you don't have to send me, Julie, a link. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Doss.
Here.
Thank you. President Hinckley
Here.
and Superintendent Wells.
Here.
Thank you.
So if you could scroll up a little bit, I think we need to first approve the agenda for the workshop. So I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
I move that we approve the agenda for our special workshop for January 5th, 2021.
I second.
Can we get a roll call, Julie?
Yes.
Clementina, your hand is up. Is that for something different?
Did you say my hand is up?
No, that
No,
was my
Clementina.
hand. Sorry,
Sorry.
Melissa. No, that was to approve the agenda.
Okay.
Student Board Member Corzo Clark.
Here.
Okay. We're taking a roll call vote to approve the agenda.
Yes, and here.
Thank you. Student Board Member Mala.
Yes.
Trustee Boyd.
Yes.
Trustee Davidson.
Yes.
Trustee Duran.
Yes.
Vice President Doss.
Yes.
Trustee pardon me, Board President Hinckley.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I noticed at the top, before we get started, at the top, there was a public comment, a reference to public comment. So we do have 6 participants on the line. So we don't have public comment built into the rest of the agenda, but I would like to give an opportunity to the people who are on now in case anybody's here to make a public comment on something not on the agenda before we jump in. And I don't see any hands up, so we can move to the first part of the agenda, which is, oh, you also have on here that we are reading the mission and vision statement. So can we have one of the student board members read our mission and vision statement?
Yes. The mission of Albany Unified School District is to provide excellent public education that empowers all to achieve their fullest potential as productive citizens. AUSD is committed to creating comprehensive learning opportunities in a safe, supportive, and collaborative environment, addressing the individual needs of each.
Our meeting rooms are to maintain a focus on what is best for students, to ensure a safe environment for all views to be expressed, treating each other, staff, and the public respectfully, to endeavor to find common solutions to issues through collaboration without sacrificing one's belief in what is best for students, and to make a commitment of effective deliberation, each one listening with an open mind while others are allowed to express their points of view.
Great, thank you. So the first thing, and I want to also just say that Trustee Duran and I spent some time formulating this agenda, so all of the best ideas came from her. So we wanted to start with a little opportunity to get to know each other and very briefly sort of state what we're here for and some information about how we're approaching our role as a board member. So we sent out a set of questions. Each board member has 5 minutes to answer the questions. And Julie, if you don't mind having the 5-minute timer up in your window or a different one, just so that folks can stay on track, that would be great. And maybe we can do it in whatever order we would be going next as a roll call vote. So I don't know who that would start with.
Sorry.
That's
I
fine.
started the roll call vote with the student board members and then Trustee Boyd. So then the next one would be Veronica Davidson.
Great. Did we lose Veronica?
I don't see her.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
She did
Great.
send us, just be reminded, we received communication from her weeks ago that she may be in parts where she have difficult time with internet, and this might be it right now.
Got it. It always happens right when you get called on. So at least in my experience. Okay, so who would be next, Julie?
Trustee Duran.
Okay. A little bit of my background in terms of education and the impact it had on me. I went to Catholic school for 12 years in Salinas. What I got out of it basically was solid basic skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the other important skill I got was in discipline. That's a hard one to teach, but after 12 years, something stuck. And the honest truth is the education that I had, it was very basic, but you know, it got me through KALB, it got me a year at Stanford, and it got me another year through Harvard. So I have to acknowledge the nuns that taught me for 12 years. For the first time, my hat's off to the nuns in Salinas. The other thing I learned about when I was in Catholic school was about class differences. And this was because we happened to live on the east side of town. And to get to school, not only did we have to cross the railroad tracks, but we also had to cross the freeway. Also, my 5 brothers and sisters and I made up the majority of the Mexican kids who attended the Catholic schools, as well as the majority of kids of color. So, you know, that lets you know there were not very many students of color in Catholic schools. I transferred from community college in Salinas to UC Berkeley in fall of 1968. What I have to say I got more than anything from Cal was a political education. Everything from Eldridge Cleaver sit-in to the Vietnam War marches to the Third World Student Strike that I participated in. And we won the right to ethnic studies and the ability and the opportunity to study our histories, our struggles as people of color here in the United States. The results of that is it transformed me. The classes that I took in ethnic studies just really changed me, gave me the confidence in myself. It was because of ethnic studies that I found my voice and also my passion. And in looking at the question about what strength do you bring to the board, my personal view is that I bring a passion that I absolutely believe that a quality education is essential for every single one of our kids. And the next was about working styles. We had a booklet from CSBA that we took this test when we first came on. It's not a test, it's just a mechanism to assess yourself. And so there's 4 options in terms of your working style. There's analytical, driver, amiable, and expressive. And for those of you that have been on the board with me for a couple years, I am number 1 driver. I am so moved to have action, to have things happen after 50 years of things being really slow for people of color in education and us being very marginalized. I really am committed to pushing for change so that all kids have the opportunities and the access so that they can choose to truly be what they want someday. I really believe education gives us those aspirations. And so saying that, my working style was the driver, of course, and the other ones were way, way far away, nowhere near analytical. Nothing came close to driver, sorry. And so that's basically it, I think, that I wanted to share with the board. And I hope that helps the board sort of get an idea of where I'm coming from as a board member. And the only other thing I'd want to add is that I really hope that this opportunity to work together in this work session will help us bond more so that we can be an effective board, which is really what I want to do. I want to be an effective board member and help the superintendent to give it the all for the kids here in Albany. Okay, thank you.
Great. So it looks like we have Veronica back. Maybe we can move back to you and then keep going on our order, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My computer won't go to Zoom anymore. So luckily we have more devices. I can only imagine how frustrating that would be if a kid ran into that.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm really excited to get to just share a little bit more about myself and just tell you guys all a little more. So I grew up here in the Bay Area. I live in a house that my family has owned for a long time in Albany. And so we feel really lucky to be raising our children here. I went to Mills College where I got my degree in child development and was very fortunate to have some amazing, amazing professors there who really helped me feel confident in going the extra step for a student's needs and really doing what it took to get those needs addressed in a classroom. And then I got my teaching credential and we moved around a little bit and I ended up back in Albany. I always wanted to teach in Albany Unified. And then because of having kids and I was running my own business, I didn't get that opportunity until last year. And I then got that chance in probably the craziest year that there ever was for more reasons than just COVID. And so I feel like I really relate to the parents. I really relate to the teachers. I've run my own business, so I relate to all of the administrators. So I'm very, very excited to get to kind of look into all of those different areas and see how I can put things together and help solve puzzles and come up with really strong solutions for our district and for our families and our school sites. Yeah, I guess coming back into all of this, okay, it's like slipping off my device here. Let me just tell you guys a little bit more about my past too. With the whole device switch up now, I've lost all my train of thought. So I'm really sorry about this not being more clean. When I was younger, I started working with children, as soon as people would let me. And I said this in a couple of my forums before I was elected, but I had one experience at Thousand Oaks when the classes were not that interesting for me. And we had a year where our teacher was out on leave for medical reasons, and the substitute just, it was overwhelming. And I was fortunate enough to get to go volunteer down the hall in the special day class. And that really changed things for me, because I was in there when one of the students who was a good friend of mine had a seizure a couple of times, and saw the reality of how that classroom operated and how little some of those kids were in our other classes. And that really triggered for me the desire to help make sure that every student gets that same experience that I just got, because it came easily to me. And that's something that I carried through. Then teaching swimming lessons, I taught for many years at Strawberry Canyon in the YMCA, and was always the one who said, oh, give me the student who's the most difficult. I'm going to help make this enjoyable for them and work with them to make this happen. And that's just something I've always really been thrilled to get to do, and wanted to give those children that opportunity. I think the hardest part for me about being on the board here is that it's not directly with the children. So I'm always reminding myself of the next step and how that's going to impact the students and the kids. And just taking that quiz that you guys sent out, that was really fun. Okay, I'm pulling it up on here. So mine came in mostly expressive, which I think really sums up my personality. And the one point that really got me was the last point on there, not good with follow through, and has a lot of ideas. So I've learned to always partner myself up with other people who are good at making sure I'm checking the boxes, making sure I'm getting all the little parts done so that my wonderful big ideas can get to their end result. That's really been evidenced in my work just here in our community with the outdoor dining in Albany Inside Out. That was sort of just this big picture idea. It could be this great thing. And there's so many little tiny check boxes that we have to make sure happen all the time. And it just continues. And I partnered up with Amy Smullins, and she just dots my I's and crosses my T's. And so that has been the best thing. And I look forward to kind of finding those relationships on the board here and in the district, so that I can balance out sort of my excitement and enthusiasm for all of this with making sure that it all gets to where it needs to be. I think that's it.
Great, thank you. Who would be next, Julie?
Next, we have Vice President Doss. Is he here? I don't see him.
I see him, or I see his picture.
If I go last.
Okay.
Sure.
Thanks.
President Hinckley, that would make you next.
Okay. So I thought a lot about the impact school has had on me, since I feel like I've been in school my whole life. So I should be able to say something. But what I thought about was that I have always been really good at school, but have also realized that that is not true for everyone, that school is set up a certain way and some people fit that box, and not everyone does, and the box is not necessarily the best fit for anybody. It's just that I was good at sort of going through the motions and doing what was expected. So I thought a lot about how that impacted the way I think about being on the board, which is to make sure that we don't just set schools up to perform for the people that find that traditional form of schooling easy or suitable for them. I think a strength I bring to the board, which I probably talk about too much, is that I do still teach in a classroom, and I teach kids who are at the in the great beyond after the system in which we have them. And so I see a lot of the, I get to spend a lot of time with young people, but I also see a lot of what I think has room for improvement in our educational system. including the fact that I'm at Cal and the student body just does not represent the student body of California. The demographics are way off. There are just too many students for whom public college, an institution like that they have a right to be at, is not attainable because we're not providing them with a good enough education before college. And I also see the stress that a lot of college students have and the intensity that they approach grades with, and how much often that intensity sort of supersedes whether they're actually interested in the material. It makes them have difficulty deciding what to do because they're so focused on meeting the assignments and getting the grades and going on to the next step. And it makes me feel that we don't often give students a lot of opportunities to really figure out who they are. And that's unfortunate because sometimes I see students who are really suffering because of that. So this year, I'm really interested in thinking about how we can use this pandemic opportunity to really think about how our education system might need some readjustment to meet the challenges of this world situation that we're in, and also to really think about some of these mental health issues that we always say we care a lot about, but I think we're still sort of responding to a mental health crisis that the school itself often creates, and we're not, I think, always digging deep enough to figure out how we really break that cycle. I also took the test. I think the great thing is that we have a mix of styles. So I'm definitely an analytical person. I'm not particularly expressive. I like to make sure that I really think through and understand everything before I make a decision. So I really appreciate being surrounded by people who are different from me and are able to be more decisive and be more expressive and think more about different dimensions of an issue. So I love that so far all three of us are different, because I think that's what makes a great board. I think one other thing I also probably talk about too much is that I came to Albany through University Village, and I lived there for 8 years. So that has dominated my perception of what it's like to be in Albany. Being in UC Village, being at Ocean View, and often feeling like we weren't really seen as real Albany has really shaped my approach to being a resident of this community and to being on the board. Even though I've now lived outside the village for 4 years. So I still am mostly a village person. And that, I think, will always shape how I approach the way we talk about Albany as a community and who belongs here, and the fact that we really have a sort of ways to go to make sure that everyone feels like they're a member of our community. And that's it.
Okay, next is Trustee Boyd.
Hello, everybody. So I am from New Jersey originally, and I went to college in New Jersey, went to law school in New York, practiced in New York for a bit, traveled in South America for a little bit, and then moved out west. So Oregon first, and then here. So that's kind of my path in that way. School for me has always meant just opportunity and being an equalizer. And I also, as President Hinckley said, am someone who did well in the traditional setup of school. And I think it's important to keep in mind that that is something that works for a specific subset of kids and not all kids, and important to keep in mind that the the sort of diversity and multitude of experiences, and not allow that to be to loom too large in my idea of what school should be or how it should be organized, and what children should be served well and be able to thrive. I was a scholarship kid and was always very grateful for the opportunities that I had. I was raised in a single parent home and wouldn't have had those opportunities without that. Was also always very aware of the differences between having the opportunity to pay your way into certain places and not, and the difference of having to work a bit harder sometimes in order to clear certain hurdles, and sometimes being made to feel as if you had not earned your place in the institution as much. So I am aware of that, and that has shaped my experience and the way that I look at schooling somewhat. A strength that I bring to the board, I think, is that I am pretty level-headed, and I've been a lot of things. I was a stay-at-home mom for 7 years before I went back to practicing law. I lived in New York City. I lived in Bend, Oregon. I live here now. I am from a different background socioeconomically than I'm currently in. I feel like I just, there are people who say, how could you possibly live in New York City? There are people who say, how could you possibly live in Bend, Oregon? There are career moms who say, how could you possibly be a stay-at-home mom? And there are stay-at-home moms who say, how could you possibly leave your children and go, and so I think that having been exposed to a lot of different experiences, different people, different cultures, I think shapes the way that I look at things and sort of see different people's viewpoints and try to balance and understand and listen. One area of interest I have on the board is supporting efforts that it's so awesome are already underway, especially at the high school, to diversify the curriculum, to continue to improve and add to the diversity in the curriculum. This year in particular, through a lot of different discussions, series, and everything that we've had at my work, and wonderful conversations that I've had, one of the things that's so amazing to so many people is what we didn't know and what we didn't learn, and understanding how that pervades. It just extends into all areas of knowledge and of society and of what we think is normal or what we're aiming for. And so being able to add to the diversity of viewpoints that our children are exposed to, I think, is just so important for our ability to understand each other. On my working styles, I actually had kind of one in each category, and then one that was, kind of the second. So I think I lean toward the analytical, but I'm also in the amiable. Sometimes it's hard to feel like people don't agree with what I'm saying. It's important to me to kind of, I can deal with conflict when I need to, but I definitely try to kind of smooth it out and get people talking and understanding each other and finding something that's somehow in the middle that works for folks. And another thing to know about me, I'm a singer and a dancer, and music is incredibly important to me, and art. And that's it.
Great. I think so. We have the student board members, but Brian wanted to be last. So,
Okay.
Audrey, you want to go?
Sure. Okay, so I've been in Albany schools since kindergarten and have a great experience here, and I live right by the Children's Center. So I'm very immersed in the Albany experience and grateful to have been. And I've learned a lot from my peers here. I really appreciate the student climate. Students are incredibly motivated and motivate me to, reach the next level on in every step, whether that be, a certain course or just a random project. I've really enjoyed working with other students. And how I got into the field of education or interested in it is from taking a summer course at UC Berkeley and learning about the broader themes of education in U.S. public schools, like tracking and privatizing the schools, and banking education, and knowing that like there's a name for this and there's reform efforts to address the things that I had observed and experienced was really inspiring to me, and it's something that I want to continue. I'll be graduating this year, but I hope to study public policy in college, wherever that will be, hopefully in California. And I've also had the privilege of working with student organizations at the state level, which work closely with the State Board of Education and Senate Committee on Education. So that's been really inspiring to me as well, and why I'm here today and continuing change in this community. I took the, I forget what it's called, but the little quiz thing, and got driver. I also got driver by a very large difference, such as just as Trustee Duran. So I think it continues the balance that we have. There was another, I think there was a question on like something random that you want to share. We watched a video in 8th grade of, and in it, there was a lamb being killed. It wasn't violent at all, but it's just a short piece, and I have not eaten meat since. So that, coming on 4 years, that's another way that my education in Albany has impacted me. Yeah, I guess I'll yield the rest of my time.
Great, thank you. Leo.
Yeah, give me a second so I can pull up the list. How has school impacted me? Well, that's a lot. Try and summarize it. So I moved around a little bit when I was younger, and I ultimately ended up in like East Bay in Albany when I was in 1st grade. We moved here from New York in 2008. And I started at Cornell. I did Cornell at 5 years. I was at Cornell for 5 years, and I was actually class of 2020. And then after Cornell, I left the district and I switched schools to go to the Pacific Boy Choir Academy, which is like a performing arts school in Oakland. And I ended up, because of like how the space, how like the class sizes worked there, I had to repeat 5th grade, which was sort of my first definitely like I sort of, because I had like known a couple kids in elementary school who had been held back, and it was always this like very stigmatized thing. And then I was held back, and I was like, oh, like I'm still learning things. Like I thought I would be bored doing 5th grade, but I'm still learning things, which is really cool. And I was meeting new people, and they were teaching me things, which I thought was cool. And PBA really changed my life, both the musical aspect and just in general being in a very small environment with like a close-knit set of friends. I know Albany has pretty big class sizes in some of the classes, but in general, having in middle school, having such a small core group of friends. I was one of 8 graduating 8th graders. I think my biggest class size in middle school was 12, and that was in 6th grade when there were 12 6th graders. But just having like a solid group of people around me that I was like comfortable with, who I loved in the learning environment, really helped me, and that sort of helped me get to know the importance of just like being valued within school, and being a part of like a larger or a smaller community within the learning environment you're in, how that can really impact your education. And I'll stop there because most of it is just building on that theme. A strength you bring to the board, I think having gone through, leaving Albany and then coming back, I feel like I have a little like more, I've like experienced more, and also knowing a lot of other people from different schools, because all of my friends after middle school branched out to different schools, and being able to talk to them, I feel like I bring a lot of like diverse points and like different experiences that I know of to the board. I also I have ADHD, so I've been pretty I've experienced, I know I'm pretty well versed in like the basic like special education programs and support that Albany offers. And I feel like I can offer a good perspective from that standpoint. An area of interest I have at the board is just like student support. Special education especially is something I worked on the LCAP a lot, and getting more support for paraeducators and things like that. And there's a lot more ways to support students, and that's been like something that I've sort of prioritized in the initiatives I've taken on. My working styles, I took the test, I got analytical, but it was actually a pretty close tie between analytical, amiable, and expressive. But I got analytical by 1 point, which I thought was interesting, but I didn't necessarily surprise me, because I like to take my time to weigh my options, or at least weigh my options very quickly. And then another thing I'd like us to know, I mean, I already said I went to music school, but I really do enjoy music. I spend a lot of time on it outside of school, and it's really like a stress reliever and something I'm passionate about. I'm also, like Audrey, involved in a lot of statewide student-led organizations and like politics and youth governance. I'm actually in a statewide association of fellow student board members. And it's really cool to see like the diversity of ideas and things that students are doing in their district and what's successful there. And I've even, Audrey and I have even like brought some of that stuff to Albany and talked about it, which I think is really cool. And yeah, I hope to continue on like the path of like politics and governance in college, wherever I end up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Vice President Doss.
Okay, hello. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I had to leave. I had to leave the other meeting so that I could join. There we go. Now I can see everybody. All right. Hello. Schools impacted me because during my time in school, I was often, almost always underestimated, and teachers often assumed that I didn't know how to do the work. I couldn't afford the supplies. Of course, you didn't do it. Of course, you don't want to do the extra credit. Of course, you don't want to. Of course, you didn't do the homework. You know, and things like that. So it was frustrating because I was a really good student and I knew the answers, and I finished my work early and I passed all my tests and I excelled. But it was this feeling of, because everybody always made me feel as if I wasn't supposed to do this stuff, then I had this weird feeling like, well, should I be doing it? Then when that happens, you tend to kind of lean in with that crowd, right? Because you have this, because that's how you're being treated. So you tend to lean that way. And so that's kind of how, education, like kind of how it went for me. So it was frustrating. And so that's really what kind of keeps me motivated on the board, because I've seen that side of it. And I would imagine that a lot of our students, or let me be specific, a lot of students that look like me probably receive that same treatment. And so kind of shedding light on that and sharing my experience, I think, helps that, or helps to stop that, I should say. I think you might be surprised, but I got driver when completing the assessment. You guys, all your faces look so surprised. But So that's what I got there. I think for me, a strength that I bring to the board is a wealth of experience, as well as the ability to respect and understand other people's perspectives. And I think another strength is the ability to move forward. I'm not going to always agree with what my fellow board members say. I'm not going to always agree with the vote, but having the ability to take all that in and then move forward, I think is important. And so I think that I bring that to the board, and I hope that that will rub off on our new board members. I think you'll realize as we're going through it that it's not as easy as it sounds. One more thing. I thought about that for a while. I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty open. So you guys probably know almost everything about me. But I guess one more thing is that I thought about sharing that, but I'm going to change it over. One thing about me that I think people might not know is that I've lived in different countries for long periods of time. I've lived in Ecuador, and I've lived in Granada, Spain. And I lived there for a while, to the point where I was like a regular at a coffee shop, and I made some friends that I still talk to today in both of those places. So yeah, that's one more thing about me that you guys might not know. I think I might have told Trustee Duran about these trips. But yeah, so that's one more thing. And if you guys are ever interested or want to talk about that more, I'm happy to share. I have lots of pictures. I also took my entire family on both of those trips. And so they got to, everybody but Emerson, she wasn't here yet. So. And I yield my last 17 seconds.
Great, thank you. It's hard to hear about international travel right now without feeling a little poignant, but thank you for sharing that. So I appreciate everyone putting so much effort and revealing so much about themselves. I hope that was a good way to help us, you know, on Zoom, get to know each other. So we're going to move to Harold's presentation. For those of you who are new to the board, Harold has done several things with us before, so he knows the three of us sort of well, for better or worse, and has been really helpful in some of our earlier discussions about board governance and board norms and meetings and so forth. Harold, I don't know the best how you want to handle questions while you're talking, since I don't know if you can see if people have hands up, or if you want us to wait till the end, or what would work best for you.
Oh, questions while we go, definitely. That will make it, I know you're all awake if you're asking questions, so that's a good thing. And I can see all of you, so all you have to do is literally physically raise your hand. I'm old fashioned that way. Okay, great. Great. Well, it's all yours. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I'll just note by a slight way of additional introduction, so folks know who this person is on the screen at the moment. One of the things that I have a background is that I've been an attorney for school districts for 27 years. And with the law firm of Lozano Smith, I'm in the Walnut Creek office. But one of the little bits of trivia about me is that one of the very first assignments I ever handled for a school district back in 1994 was for Albany Unified School District. So I've actually worked with you guys for 27 years in various capacities. So I know the area well, I know the school district well. I'm a Cal grad, so I have that background with all of you that went to Cal. And the other thing I should just note is Trustee Boyd, I had to at least compare notes because we went to the same law school. We both went to Columbia Law School. So somehow we both found our way from New York to here. Very small world. On the agenda, I know it says I'm going to talk about the Brown Act. I had the opportunity to talk to the board president and the superintendent leading into this and really hone in, because you can't really do a Brown Act presentation in the time we have. This is really sort of some highlights of the Brown Act, some key points, because I know everybody at this point has received some degree of training in it. Little explanation of what it is and how it fits with your policies. It's really more of a discussion though about communications. So even though it says Brown Act, we're going to talk also about board communications internally with each other and with the community. And what I'd observe about the Brown Act, the Brown Act is California's open meeting law. It's a wonderful, great law that makes sure that you conduct the public's business in public. It's also a way for you to stub your toe along the way if you're not really careful about it. I always talk about the fact that school districts are on a road. You're on this nice path where you're trying to get somewhere. Greater diversity, higher test scores, greater rates of graduation, improving education. You want to avoid as many potholes in the road as you can. And the Brown Act, these issues around it can become what I worked in Texas for a little while, they called chug holes, which are those giant potholes that can swallow an entire school bus. So really the goal today is to talk about some of those areas you want to avoid stubbing your toes. And as I said, feel free, raise your hand if you have a question as I go. I also didn't want to do a PowerPoint because I wanted everybody to be able to look at each other. You have, if you're interested in it, you have something that looks like this, which was attached to the agenda, which is our board member toolkit. You have the distinction of being the first school district in California to get our 2021 edition, which we literally rushed out so it would be ready for you all today. And what's in there is a very simplistic summary of the Public Records Act, the Brown Act, and conflict of interest laws, which we'll also talk a little bit about today. And I'll refer as we go, if you're somebody who likes to take notes and you happen to have a hard copy of it around with you, I'll mention in a few points what page I'm on in there or where we're talking about those particular issues if you're interested. So with that, what are the basics of the Brown Act? The concept of the Brown Act is, as I said, you do the public's business in public, that you are supposed to be transparent in doing so, that generally your meetings are in open session and available to the public to observe, unless there's specific opportunities to go into closed session, and we'll talk about what some of those are. Closed session meaning the public doesn't attend with you. And generally speaking, you have to post agendas like you did for the meeting today to let people know what it is you're going to be talking about. And if you distilled all of the Brown Act, those are sort of the key concepts in it. So why is the Brown Act important? Aside from the transparency issue, as I said, it can really be something that obstructs your progress. If you don't get it quite right, you may have to do some redos along the way. And that just slows down that path that you're on to where you're trying to get. And the other thing I always have to say is that violation of the Brown Act can be a crime. It can be something that gets you sued, but it actually, if it's an intentional violation of the Brown Act, it can get you into criminal trouble. Now, I'm really, really happy to say that in 27 years, I've not had a client go to jail because of a violation of the Brown Act. Oh yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I had a question and then I just took a bite of my dinner. Maybe I should rethought that. But I have a question and I hope it's okay that I'm asking it, Trustee Boyd, but I wanted to know that because one of our trustees is an attorney, are there additional penalties or things that she should worry about as it relates to the Brown Act?
It's a good question. And, I work with a lot of school districts that have board members who are attorneys. Generally speaking, the rules apply equally to all of you. The one thing that I would note that I think is very relevant to your question, Brian, is if you were ever to have somebody accuse the district of an intentional Brown Act violation, that would be 3 to 5 board members meeting secretly in a dark alley somewhere to conduct business outside of the public eye, knowing you're violating the Brown Act. The district attorney who is interested in that would look into the question of whether
Computer's having
you
some
were
serious
aware.
problems tonight.
Uh-oh, Veronica, you're having problems? Oh, there we go. I love technology when it works. So the only thing I'd say to Trustee Boyd is, it's an intent issue. Did you intend to violate the Brown Act? The first question is always, did you know what the Brown Act said? And it is conceivable that a lawyer will be held to a higher standard. And I did have one case a million years ago in another county where the district attorney got very interested in what they thought was a violation of the Brown Act. And they focused on the attorney who was on the board because they assumed that the attorney would know better or would know best. So it's a good question, but generally speaking, the rule applies to all of you. And as I said, I only talk about the criminal part of this because you need to know. It's unlikely this will ever happen. You have a 5-member board, and I always joke that, you know, the good Lord gave us 5 fingers for a reason, which is 5 board members. If you can count to 3, you have to stop discussing things. If you're not in a noticed board meeting, 2 of you can talk about something, but when it gets to the 3rd one, it's a problem. So that's why you have those 5 fingers. One of the most common mistakes that I see, if you just wanted to put it at the top of the list of how the Brown Act gets violated by accident, is something called reply all. So I want you all, if you take nothing else away from this, never use the reply all feature when replying to an email in relation to school district business unless you look really closely at who you're replying to. There's been a lot of instances and a lot of cases where somebody just sends out an email with their thoughts to the rest of the board or to the superintendent, copy to the board, and somebody sends back their reply all. You now have 2-way communications, you count to 5, you've got a Brown Act problem. So there's just some big picture issues about the Brown Act that I wanted to note. Just a few highlights of the Brown Act before we talk about some of the board communications issues. And by the way, if you are a glutton for punishment and you really are interested in the Brown Act, I actually recommend reading it. It's a really interesting read. I almost never go through it without finding something that I'd forgotten about or didn't quite see the nuance. You will all get, I'm gonna hold up something else to the camera. You're all gonna get, when it comes out, our 2021 edition of the Brown Act Handbook as one of our clients that has the entire text of the Brown Act and a summary of the Brown Act as well. It's definitely worth reading because it's a rich journey into all the nuances. I've heard people jokingly say before that the Brown Act is really the gray act because there's so many fine lines and nuances. And one of the things I'll talk to you about, some of the recent changes for 2021 really starts to get sort of on the head of a pin level of detail about what you can and can't do under the Brown Act. One thing I wanted to note is there's 2 different kinds of board meetings, special meetings and regular board meetings. Your regular board meetings are it's something that is set up in a calendar that you adopt annually. Generally speaking, you have to have at least 72 hours notice for those meetings. Your agenda goes out 72 hours in advance. There's also special board meetings. You get 24 hours notice of those meetings. And the reason I wanted to draw the distinction between them is that a special board meeting, you only have to allow public comment on that which is on the agenda. At a regular general board meeting, you have to allow public comment on anything within the jurisdiction of the school district. So that's an important distinction to understand. There's also certain actions you can only take at a regular meeting, not at a special meeting. So if you were to, for example, renew the superintendent's contract, and as part of that, you are adopting a new contract or an amendment, you generally have to do that at a regular meeting, not a special meeting. That's a fine little rule, but just it's good to be aware as you walk into a meeting to be thinking about, is this a regular meeting? Is this a special meeting? Because it really will help define the scope of what you're doing. And that's talked about on page 3 of our toolkit, if you're interested in following on that part. There are certain things that are not a meeting, and this is really important to understand as well. Again, this is on page 3 of our toolkit. So whenever you have a quorum of the board, meaning 3 or more, discussing district business, whether you're taking actions, whether you're making decisions, it doesn't matter. You're just talking about district business. Whenever there's 3 that are doing that, you have a board meeting with narrow exceptions that are laid out in the Brown Act. Things that are not board meetings are individual contact. If one of you talks to one other board member, that is not a Brown Act violation. That's not a meeting of a quorum of the board. And we'll talk about the exceptions to that in a moment. Attending public conferences, going to the California School Boards Association conference is the classic example. If we ever actually get to go in person again, which I hope we will, that's an example where you're okay to be, obviously you're talking about school district related issues while you're there. The distinction is that you would not want to have the 5 of you go to dinner and start discussing a specific matter that's before the board on your next agenda. You can be talking about education and the conference generally, like today at the conference, I heard that types of conversation. Community meetings, if a quorum of you, 3 or more, show up at a city council meeting, for example, that's not a Brown Act violation. We usually suggest that if you do that, if you weren't intending to all go together, don't sit together, because even though we say it's not a board meeting, as soon as people see 3 of you sitting in the same place, they're going to think it's a board meeting. They're going to think you're talking about district business. So unless you're there as a delegation to the city council, even though you know each other and you like each other, for appearance sake, probably best not to sit together. And then social gatherings. You can always go to another board member's child's wedding, to their wedding, to a bar mitzvah, to a christening, you name it. That is not a Brown Act violation. But the exception to all of that is serial meetings. And I know all of you have probably heard about this. In my PowerPoints, when I do it, I have a really stupid cartoon, which is a picture of a box of cereal talking to another box of cereal. That's not what we mean by serial meeting. A serial meeting is where multiple of you talk to each other, but not all at the same time. And so there's 2 different kinds of serial meetings. There's what are called the chain or link meetings, and there's hub and spoke meetings. And again, this is one of those areas where we most commonly see the Brown Act violated by accident without people realizing they're violating it. So with a chain or link version of a serial meeting, what happens is board member A says something to board member B, usually by email, because that's the world we live in. And board member B then forwards that email to board member C. Even though they didn't talk to each other directly, you have 3 board members communicating indirectly in this way. That would be viewed as a potential Brown Act violation if you're talking about district business. The hub and spokes version of it is that you have somebody who's the hub. So board member A talks to board member B, and then to board member C, and then to board member D, and then to board member E about a particular issue. Even though it didn't all happen at once, it's still potentially a Brown Act problem. So just be aware when emails are going back and forth, when you're talking to somebody, there's potential issues that can come up. Leo, I think you have a question?
Yeah,
See a hand up?
so Aj and I were student board members, so we have a preferential vote, so it doesn't affect the numerical outcome. So I know most of the Brown Act doesn't present to us, but we also speak to a lot of board members outside of meetings. Would stuff like serial or hub meetings, would those limitations apply to us?
Yeah, you know, it's a really good question. There's no court in California that has ever addressed that issue. Our position is generally that it wouldn't apply to you in the sense that you have a preferential vote, but it's really an advisory vote. And so you don't fill that same role. There is language in the Brown Act that says for purposes of quorum counting to 5, that student board members don't count towards that. So generally speaking, no. The exception is if board member A came to you and said, hey, can you go tell board members B and C my opinion on this, your answer should be no. That's where you start to be used as an intermediary for a violation of the Brown Act. And it's very clear in the text of the Brown Act, you can violate the Brown Act through intermediaries. And that always raises the question too, by the way, what happens if a member of the public comes and talks to each of you? And my general advice there is if they start saying, well, board member A told me this and board member B told me this, just tell them, I just want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to hear what the other board members have to say. That's what our board meetings are for. Clementina, did you have a question? Oh, but you're on mute.
Sorry. I wanted to ask you, Harold, when you talk about district business, that is just so expansive. And I'm wondering if, say, 3 of us have children doing a sports, and we happen to be at a game, and then we're talking about fundraising or something like this, and then somehow down the road, it gets to a board meeting via a committee that's fundraising or something like that. Are any of those kinds of discussions things we should avoid? Anything as innocent as athletics? Although athletics probably is not so innocent, is it?
Yeah, what I would say is, at the risk of not sounding like a lawyer, sometimes common sense has to prevail. And this is one of those areas where you kind of have to police each other and police yourself. to be thinking about. If you're just talking about, hey, you know, isn't X team doing great this year, or isn't it wonderful that we received a grant from the city to improve the fields, something like that is probably not a problem. If you start taking it to the next level of the conversation, somebody starts saying, oh, you know what, we should as a district approach the city to talk to them about lighting. Now you're starting to talk about acting collectively, you're starting to get into that area of district business. And the best thing I can say to you all is work cooperatively to catch those moments, to catch each other, because that's, again, the Brown Act is almost always violated accidentally. So it's a good question. It is really broad. District business is intentionally broad to cover a lot. And even though this is not a Public Records Act presentation, the one thing I should mention is it applies to your records too. When you're putting things in writing, your emails, etc. Anything that it has to do with district business, very broadly defined in your writing it as in your role as a board member, is potentially going to be subject to the Public Records Act. So the old saying, if you don't want to see it in the newspaper, don't put it in writing, definitely applies to you all. So back to the Brown Act, though, if we can go through, you know, I mentioned that generally you have to conduct business in open session unless there's exceptions that allow you to go into closed session. And again, closed session usually literally is closed session. You go in behind closed doors. The public does not attend with you. And generally speaking, it is confidential. One of the mistakes a lot of school boards make is they ask the question to start with, what, you know, we'd like to go into closed session, or this thing is a sensitive issue, so we wanted to go into closed session. It's actually very narrow what you can do when you go into closed session, what the different topics are. And in page 6 of our toolkit, we talk about it. I wanted to highlight just a few of them here for you. So it's not just it's sensitive, therefore you get to go into closed session, where somebody's feelings will be hurt, and then you want to go into closed session. These are the main categories. First one is real property transactions. If you're buying or selling or leasing property, generally speaking, you don't want to let the world know what you're telling your real property negotiator is your bottom line dollar, because then you're never going to do better than that. A second category, and this is one I want to pause on because there's a lot of questions around it, is labor negotiations. And interestingly, when you go into closed session for labor negotiations, it's actually not under the Brown Act. It's under the RADA Act. It's under state and federal law having to do with labor negotiations that exempts you from having to have that discussion in public. And the purpose of going into closed session, which can also be labeled under the Brown Act as well, is to give direction to and to hear from your labor negotiators. That's the purpose of the closed session. This is one of the hardest things, I think, especially for newer board members, because you're getting hit with all this really interesting information. You all have friends who are teachers. Some of you yourselves were teachers. You know people who are going to be affected by these decisions. And there's a lot of conversation that happens at the Safeway or outside of the public library, or back in the days when we actually used to go outside, or just through social media and email chatter, where there's a lot of interest in, wait, what's the district's position about this? Or, hey, you're a board member. I really want to share with you my concern that I have about, gosh, the lighting in my classroom is terrible. Or the equipment that I've been provided by the district to do my Zoom lessons isn't functioning well. All of those issues are potentially issues that are subject to negotiations. Negotiations are very, very broad. They cover issues like workplace conditions, there's the lighting, provision of materials, there's the laptop that was provided to do your Zoom class. It can include anything having to do with salary. Obviously, it's a very, very broad range. And under both federal and state law, the general rule is you can only engage in labor negotiations through your negotiator, through your identified selected negotiator, your identified negotiating team. If you have a conversation with somebody outside of that closed session about what was discussed in the closed session, or if you spend time listening to grievances about some of these negotiable issues, especially while bargaining is going on, you may be engaged in something called end run negotiations or direct dealing, meaning you're not going through your identified labor negotiators. And as soon as that happens, somebody can bring what's known as an unfair labor practice charge against you. which could lead to sanctions and spending attorney's fees, and litigating, and all sorts of things you don't want to do. So one of the hardest things as a board member is that you have to spend a lot of your time biting your tongue on these particular issues outside of the closed session. You know, the time to ask questions, the time to get information is in those closed sessions when you're discussing negotiations. And if you're approached by a teacher, if you're approached by a member of the classified union and they want to talk about the condition of their school, you have to start thinking before you go too far with that about, am I getting into an area of negotiations? And if you're not sure, it's okay to tell them, look, I'm not sure if it's proper for us to talk about this. Let me check. Let me check is one of my favorite answers. I love when a board member says, let me check. And that can be a call to the superintendent. It can be a call to the board president. They can check with your labor negotiators to see if this is something that's allowable or not. But I wanted to pause on that one for a little bit because this is another area where we see a lot of stub toes, where people make mistakes. So that's another part of closed session. Other closed session topics that are allowable are a conference with your legal counsel regarding litigation. And there's very specific rules about how you agendize that and what you have to do with that. One thing that people forget, and I'm not just putting in a plug for lawyers here, is that it is conference with your legal counsel. So it's not just the board getting together to talk about, gosh, might we get sued? The concept is to preserve attorney-client privilege. This is when you get to meet with your attorney or talk to them on the phone, or at a bare minimum have advice that they are passing on in written form, for example, through the superintendent. Other examples, personnel exceptions. Obviously, when you're talking about particular individual employees, generally speaking, that's a closed session topic, whether it's under evaluation, potential discipline matters, for example. Those are all appropriate for closed session. Public safety is another one. You could talk about public safety issues affecting the schools. The reason that got added to the Brown Act is because you have, the Brown Act doesn't just apply to school districts, it's local government, cities, special districts. You all are talking about issues like school safety plans or police reaction times and plans if there's an emergency. You don't generally want to make that information available to the bad guys. So that's all topics you can discuss in closed session. And it actually got to be something we used a lot during the COVID emergency because we were talking about school safety. We were talking about how to implement these decisions around reopening schools and whatnot. And some of that led to some closed session discussions where there's potential risk that was being discussed around all of this. And then the last category I'll mention for you, it's not the last of all the categories, but the most common one for you is specific to school districts. You won't find it in the Brown Act, but you can talk about particular student issues in closed session. So that's state and federal law, in particular FERPA under federal law. You are not required to discuss a particular student's needs in open session, whether it's a discipline matter, student transfer issue, a question about a particular individual student situation generally is appropriate for closed session. And what all of those closed sessions have in common is they are confidential. And when I say they are confidential, they're very confidential. You cannot take the information from that closed session out of the room. And I will tell you, and I've told the story to the other board members who were around for this last year, there was many years where my kids went to a school district that I represented. And I would come home from board meetings where I was in closed session, and my wife, as a curious parent, would ask me, what's going on with this and what's going on with that? Couldn't tell her. If you got it in closed session, the only other people you can talk to about it were the people that are in the closed session. And that really is a critical part of the Brown Act and something to remember. So that's a little bit about the Brown Act. And when I say a little bit, it was a very little bit because we don't have that much time tonight. Again, for those who are gluttons for punishment, on January 15th, if there's still availability, there's a CSBA presentation, California School Boards Association, a 3-hour segment just on the Brown Act, and I'm presenting it. So if you want to hear more from me, that's a good way to do it. But I want to talk too about the communications part, right? We talked about the rules, the technical parts, but there's also important parts about board communication that are entwined with all of this. You are fortunate to be in a school district that spends as much time as any district I work with on your board governance handbook. Many school districts have board governance handbooks that just are dusty things that sit on a shelf, and your district actually revisits it annually. I've had the privilege to work with you on it and agonize over some of the language and really try to work it out. It has terrific language in there about your protocols and sort of the rules of engagement that you've all embarked on that have to do with communications, board communications. And so in addition to the homework of telling you someday you should read the Brown Act, you really should read your board governance handbook. It's a really good one. It's current, it's up to date, and it talks a lot about your meetings. When you have board meetings, one of the big rules to remember, and this is sort of one of Harold's basic rules of board meetings where things can kind of go sideways, is that it is a meeting of the school board to conduct the school board's business in front of the public. It isn't a town hall meeting. It isn't a public meeting where you're there along for the ride. You have very limited time together. You have a lot of business you've got to do, and the public is allowed to see you do that business and to comment on it, but the meeting is still your meeting. And if you go through the Brown Act, if you go through particularly your governance handbook, you'll see a lot of different protocols that are exactly around that. How do you engage with the public at these meetings? But I would encourage you all, it's a little hard now because this rule doesn't apply as much because we're all on Zoom. But when you're at a board meeting, again, with live audiences, the most dysfunctional board meetings I've ever seen are the ones where there's this dialogue going between the audience and the board, because the board isn't getting their work done. And so it's very uncomfortable and constrained to tell people you have 2 minutes to present your thoughts to the board. They're obviously always welcome to put things in writing and share them with the board. It's really awkward to cut somebody off who's passionate about one of these issues. But it is important to remember that there are limits on what you can do. One rule I want to say, by the way, before I get back to the technical rule on this, there's a great line in your board governance handbook that I wanted to share here about how you deal with each other during board meetings and you deal with the public. And what it says is, make a commitment to effective deliberation, each one listening and considering with an open mind, while others are allowed to express their points of view, even if one disagrees. That's a great statement. One of the things you can't tell because I'm doing all the talking, but there's also that old saying that there's a reason you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You're supposed to do more listening than talking. And your policy basically says that. Listen to one another during your board meetings and respect that and respect the audience as well. Now, that said, there is a technical rule under the Brown Act. When the public comments, when they make comments, there's very little that the board can do to respond at that board meeting. You're limited to the following. This is basically the list that's in the government code. You can make brief responses, and brief responses means, thank you for your comments. It was nice to see you. Thank you for being here tonight. I mean, brief comments. You can give a brief report. What that means is if somebody says, well, I'm wondering if anybody from the board even attended the city council meeting, it's okay to say after the person's done speaking, just to note, I was at that city council meeting. You don't want to, again, you want to make it be a very brief statement. You can refer something to staff, and this is one of the best tools at your disposal. Somebody says something and you're passionate about it and you really want to respond, it's appropriate to tell staff, we'd like you to follow up on this, or we'd like to see this on a future agenda. You're not taking action that night. You're not engaging in a prolonged discussion on it. And you can also ask clarifying questions. Clarifying questions are just that. Clarifying questions is, I'm sorry, did you say 12 or 13? Or did you indicate you were a parent at X school, or was it Cornell? So those are the kind of brief comments you can make. The reason it's that brief is not just so you keep control of your meeting, it's also critically because if you start engaging in a dialogue with a member of the audience who raised an issue that isn't on your agenda, you now having a public meeting on a topic that you did not agendize, and the public isn't aware that you're going to be talking about it, that can be a Brown Act violation. And that's a way to help audience members understand why you're not engaging in that dialogue with them. Also be aware during the meetings, you often will have a device in front of you. There's my visual aid, and you will be getting texts because that's our lives. You'll be getting emails and texts. You have to be really mindful. It's one thing if you're getting a text from your kid telling them that they have a sore throat and are wondering what time you're going to be home. But what we often see is that board members start texting each other, or people in the audience start texting multiple board members. And all of a sudden you have two board meetings going on. You have the one that the public is watching on screen or in person when that time comes. And you have the secret board meeting that's going on by text in the background. Well, secret meetings are not allowable. And so you have to be very cautious about answering texts, about sending texts during board meetings. And I would even say just the appearance of it. If people see board members on their device up at the front of the room, they're going to be curious about what it is you're doing. And even if it's completely innocent, it's going to raise question marks about, is there some secret discussion going on? I have to share a story here. It's a true story. It's happened many, many, many years ago down in San Diego, where a school board member was speaking. And while they were speaking, they kind of sat in the middle of the dais. A board member on the far end of the dais started texting something. And then a board member at the other end of the dais laughed. And that board member started texting something. And the board member at the other end of the dais laughed. Well, it was really clear they were having a dialogue with each other. And it was also kind of rude because there was another board member speaking. So a Public Records Act request got made. And what the Public Records Act revealed, the request revealed, was that they were making fun of this person's weight. The two board members at either end of the dais were making fun of the speaking board member's weight. And to make it even worse, this is obviously not good governance. To make it even worse, one of them said, and I'm sorry for saying this, but it was what they actually said in the text, that this person was so fat that they'd like to shoot them, but they wouldn't even feel it. Now the district attorney got involved because that could be a terrorist threat. And I'm sure these two board members just were having fun and didn't think much about this. You have to be really, really mindful about what you put in writing. I know none of you would ever say anything like that about each other, but you have to be mindful about it. You have to be mindful of what the public is seeing when you're up there texting each other. So be very careful about that. And the last part of this that I want to talk to you about, and I know we've got a break coming up. I'm trying to catch us up on the time. We're a little bit behind. So we're going to hopefully get back on track and see if there's any questions. The next thing I wanted to talk about is two recent developments. One of them is remote meetings, what we're doing tonight. And the other is a new rule about social media, board members and social media, which is a nice, juicy topic. So we are meeting tonight virtually. There are normally rules for board meetings in California under the Brown Act that you have to have a quorum of the board actually located in the district. You can't be out of the district, and that if you have board members calling in or Zooming in, that they have to allow the public to attend at the location that they're calling or Zooming in from. Yes, that can mean your hotel room. It can mean all sorts of unusual things, people at your house, et cetera. Governor Newsom back in March, as one of his executive orders, suspended all of those rules of the Brown Act. You still have to comply with the Brown Act, but you can do it the way we're doing it tonight without letting people into your house, without having to post a notice at your house, without having to be within the boundaries of the school district. The reason I mention that is because eventually that executive order is going to go away and the vaccines are going to work and our lives are going to get back to normal, I hope. And when that happens, we've all gotten really kind of lazy about, well, we can just call in. And we're going to go back to the old rule, which is you can't just call in unless it's indicated on the agenda, it's disclosed, it's posted at your location. One rule that did roll over is that you do have to take your actions by roll call vote if you have people calling in remotely. And generally speaking, we think that applies to school board meetings done by Zoom as well. So roll call vote is required. That's our conclusion. A lot of districts aren't doing that. If you're not doing it, I'm not going to ask you if you are or not. I strongly recommend that you do because it comes along with the territory. And then the last piece I want to talk to you about on all of this is the new rules that are out there on social media. So California, strangely, the home of Silicon Valley and where the internet comes from, was one of the only states in the country that had no law answering the question about whether school board members and other elected officials could use social media to discuss district business. And this has led to headache after headache after headache because we don't know what to tell you. We had no real advice to give you other than be really careful. So one of the questions that came up a lot is board member A posts something on their Facebook page about how they support a particular action the board's going to take. And board members B and C give it the old thumbs up. right? The Facebook thumbs up. Is that a Brown Act violation or not? And California law made it unclear. Could you have 3 board members attending some social media session without agendizing it as a board meeting if school district issues came up? All of those were curious questions. Well, the legislature has finally, effective this year, so it's now in effect, put into law, it's in, if you want to look it up, Government Code section 54952.2, you'll find it. As part of AB 992, they tried to answer some of these questions. And good for us lawyers, because they only answered some of them and they raised other questions, but I can tell you what the new law says. So first, I'm going to tell you what your board governance handbook says, which I think you're probably going to have to update now, because what it says is conversations on social media are a violation of the Brown Act if more than 2 board members participate. That's what that's what the handbook says. And that was a very conservative, probably appropriate reading of the Brown Act. However, the law changed. Again, this is just recently effective. So now there's certain things that you expressly can do as a board member through social media. You can answer questions from the public. Well, it seems pretty straightforward, right? You can provide information to the public. Okay, that seems fairly straightforward. You can solicit information from the public. Okay, again, fairly straightforward. What's different now is that it's okay if all 5 of you see that. It is no longer a potential Brown Act violation if a board member puts out onto the world out there on Facebook that they support something in particular. Your passive receipt or reading of that is not a Brown Act violation. But what the law also says is that a majority of the board can't use social media to discuss matters of district business. So you can't have a dialogue around it, and you can't respond directly to another board member. So the thumbs up that we didn't know if that was okay or not, one board member can no longer give thumbs up to another board member on Facebook or like the post or however you want to say that, if it's a matter of district business. It's okay if you read it, but it's not okay to respond to it. And you're not supposed to be using it as a way of creating 2-way dialogue. So the good news is we can now tell you, you don't have to panic if you see something out there on social media you weren't even looking for and it's from another board member. You do have to worry about not responding to that and not using social media as a way to create a chain, again, a serial meeting back and forth. So it's going to take a while to shake out what that new law means. And Sarah, just one quick thought, and then I'll get to your question. The general rule on this, you're going to hear this from me a lot tonight, is if you're not sure, ask. If you're not sure if you can respond to something, if you're not sure if you should be posting something, contact the superintendent. He can contact legal counsel as needed, and we can sort that out. Yeah, Sarah, you had a question.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think it's related to the Brown Act, but when I was trained about sort of what do you do if 3 of you end up in a community meeting together, sort of what you described earlier, I was also told it's important to see, you know, is this a community meeting that was available to anybody in the community, in which case it's okay for you all to be there, but if it's sort of a private meeting that the 3 of you all show up to, that probably one of you should leave. And one of the things in our community is there are these closed Facebook groups, private Facebook groups. And when they first started, I know members of the city council felt uncomfortable even being in a private Facebook group with one other city council member, or for sure 2 others. And I wonder, I've never heard a sort of authoritative statement about it, but it seems to me just being in or participating as a board member in a private group, which I have totally done, seems potentially problematic because it is a closed environment. And I wonder if you've heard anything about how this new law might apply, or if you would apply that same standard of 3 of us showing up to a private meeting being a problem.
Yeah, you know, I think it's going to take some time for that to shake out. I think that your analogy is the perfect one. If 3 of you show up at a city council meeting, I'm not particularly worried about it. if 3 of you are invited to a community meeting by a community organizer and you show up to their house and it's the community organizer, their spouse, and the 3 of you, I have serious concerns that that was not open to everybody else. So the most conservative read of it is that you don't join a closed Facebook page that is only available to certain people to discuss district business if there's another board member in it. If it's just you, that could be you talking to your constituents, as people like to say. But if there's 2 board members in that closed group, I get worried. There's another district who, of course, shall remain nameless that I work with, that I found out one of the board members had 2 other board members on a 5-member board in their closed Facebook page. And on that one, I was able to tell them that just no, that's just a flat no. One other one is probably not as much of a concern. But like I said, it's going to take a while to see how this chases down with the new law. You're not supposed to use the social media as a way of direct communications with another board member. And so it may even make a difference if that closed group is it, to be in the closed group, you have to be a citizen of the United States, or you have to be a resident of Albany, or, whatever else it is. That's a much broader group than, it's only my 20 best friends I'm going to invite to do it. And I admit I'm a total idiot about Facebook. I don't know how it works, and I'm not on it, and I don't want to be on it. And the reason I don't want to be on it is because I don't want to have to answer these kinds of questions for myself. But for you, I understand it's important.
Yeah, I mean, just
Yeah,
to
Clementina.
clarify, these aren't tiny little groups, but these are sort of Albany wide, but they are technically private in the sense that you have to be admitted into it by some type of administrator. So anyway, just to clarify.
Yeah, I think if it's Albany wide, there's lower risk as long as there's not a quorum that are then in that group. Once you get the quorum in the group, you probably do want it to be something open to everyone. Clementina, you had a question?
Yes, real quick. Harold, how do we frame things as board members so we're careful when public asks our opinion and we respond to them, but we want to ensure that the public knows we're speaking only for ourselves, that we are not representing 4 other members on the board. So how do we be really careful about that?
Yeah, well, you're giving me a great transition to what we're going to address after the break, because we're actually going to talk exactly about that as part of the ethics and public service, of how to communicate with the public as to whether it's your position or it's the board's position. So we will come back to that. But should we take a break, Sarah? Are we there?
I want to make sure nobody else has any questions. Nope. Yeah, Melissa.
I did have a question, which I was just going to kind of hold, but since it's about the thing we were just talking about, maybe it just makes sense to ask it now. So on the Facebook group thing, or the closed meeting sort of comparison, is that not a situation where if you're not saying anything, but you read other people's comments, that's fine? It's just that you shouldn't be commenting, or literally by your presence in a space, whether it's a closed meeting in real life or the Facebook group or in virtual life, just your presence is problematic?
If you read the new law literally, I think there's an argument to be made that you're okay if you are not actually responding. The question again may come back to how small of a group this is, because if it's a group, if you have a group of 5, it's probably pretty direct communications to you and the other 4 people. If you have a group of 500, then it's probably not directed specifically to you. But literally what the law says is that you can't respond directly to a communication from another one of these board members. And it's okay for you to see it. Because the legislature was silent on all of this, I would be hesitant, again, if it's a small group. I tell you, I have a cheat code, and I'm going to go to my cheat code because this is a really interesting question, and I'll get back to Frank on what I find. The origin of this law is actually an attorney in my firm who used to be the city attorney for Sacramento, and he was the one who got the legislature moving in this direction. He has since joined our firm. I'm going to just ask him, because I know that what he had talked about as being proposed would have been a lot more explicit on these issues, and the legislature simplified it a little bit. But I'm going to ask him if that actually came up, if the sort of closed group idea came up, and I'll let you know what I find out.
So if there aren't more questions on the Brown Act, we are about 7 minutes behind, which is not bad for us. And that was because I miscalculated the introduction numbers. So we can take a 10-minute break, I think, for mental health and come back at 7:42. Don't leave the meeting though, I think. We can turn your camera off. And yeah, we'll see each other back here at 7:42.
Ryan, Audrey and I will have to be leaving a little early. Oh yeah, sorry, Audrey and I have college apps due tonight, so we have to dip a little early to work on this.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank
Do
you.
what you need to do. All right.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye. So Audrey and Leo are both filling out college applications, so they're not coming back. I'm going to make sure we've got the rest of us back. So we're returning from a break. I just want to make sure that we're all here. Brian and Veronica, are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I'll give Veronica a minute.
Yeah, yes, I'm here. I got my camera off for a little bit because I'm also working, doing some 6th grade homework. So I don't want you guys to see me struggling here.
So I know Veronica was having some tech issues before, but actually, this makes me want to ask something that you mentioned in the context of the Brown Act, which is, you know, thinking about the scenario where we're in a physical board meeting and people can see that we're there and we're engaged, and then the warning you gave about making sure we're not texting. When I was at a CSBA session, somebody actually brought up that they actually said they were advised to have cameras on and not be muted so that the public could be sure that people were present and not talking to each other. Having everybody unmuted seems a little chaotic, but I did want to see if you've heard advice about requiring that we have cameras on just so that the public can actually see that we're attending the meeting, and also be sure that we're not having conversations off camera that they're not privy to, which would for sure be a violation of the Brown Act. I'm sorry for not asking that earlier, but.
No, that's a great question. I'm actually glad you asked it because I meant to mention it. So it's a good reminder. So the governor's executive order is really what controls this. And the governor's executive order that allows you to have the kind of meeting we're having tonight uses the language that you have to provide the ability to, quote, observe and address telephonically or otherwise electronically. The public has to be able to observe and address. So the observation part of it, there is an argument to be made that if you have your camera off during a board meeting, and I know some of you have had to do that tonight, and I'm not saying it's a Brown Act violation, because it's really not a Brown Act issue, it's the governor's executive order. Are you depriving somebody of the opportunity to observe if you have the cameras off? It's almost like the board's meeting and you can hear everything they're saying, but they're in another room and you can't see them. And so the better practice is to have the cameras on. There's nothing that says, as far as having your microphone on, we actually generally recommend against that because you're at home, phones are ringing, dogs are barking, kids are shouting out inappropriate things. I do a lot of board meetings, so trust me, I've seen and heard it all. So I'm not sure that I agree on the sound. The other thing about the sound is you can tell if somebody's having a conversation on camera with somebody, you know, when they're talking and suddenly they're looking this way and mouthing words. That's probably something you don't want to do as a board member because you want to show people that your attention's focused there, and you don't want to raise the question of, you know, is somebody there telling you what to say, which obviously is probably not the case, but it creates this bad look, this bad impression. So this is less, excuse me, to me, a Brown Act problem and more are we complying with the governor's executive order? And I would say generally, if you can leave your camera on, if you're going to turn your camera off, you know, Brian earlier indicated he was going to turn his camera off, but he told us why. He told us what he was doing. He confirmed that he was present. So if you're going to do it, that's a good practice. Just like there's a board member I saw do something once that I really liked during a live board meeting. And she said, normally I keep my phone off during the meetings, but I have a sick kid at home. So if you see me texting, it's because I have a sick kid at home. And then nobody sat and questioned why she was a little more distracted than usual in the meeting because she was texting. So I think if you do have to turn your camera off for a reason, just say it, address the board president, say, I apologize, I need to turn my camera off for the next 10 or 20 minutes because fill in the blank reason, but I will be listening to the meeting. The other thing that turning the camera off can do is if you're having, for example, a public hearing where you're taking testimony on something, which boards from time to time do, how does the person know that their testimony is being heard? And when the board member then votes, how do you prove that the board member was participating to be able to vote? So particularly if it's a public hearing, something formal like that, I would absolutely keep the cameras on. Microphones, I'm not so sure about.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So shall I dive into our next segment now?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Well, so the next, yeah, thank you. So the next part, just like the last part was technically a discussion of the Brown Act, but was really broader about communications. We're going to broaden again. So what the agenda has is ethics and public service. We're going to talk about this broadly. This is not, again, a training on legal ethics for school board members and limited to that. We'll talk a little bit about it for some of the technical issues, but it's also other issues we want to talk to you about, like tips for spotting potential conflict issues, board member liability questions. That's something I love to talk to board members about because very few trainings are done in the state where new school board members are told, here's areas where you may be personally liable for something. And I think as board members, you should know what those general areas are. And we'll talk a little bit about those. I know I covered some of this with the board members who were incumbents last year, but we'll touch bases on that briefly. And then we'll finish with really the broad discussion of public service about interacting with the public and with staff in general. And that's when we'll get to Clementina's question about how do you make clear whose position is that you're representing? What are the rules around that? And again, your board governance handbook is great on some of these topics, and I'll share some of the language from that with you as well. But I want to start off with actually a quote from the board governance handbook, because this to me is a great way of addressing legal ethics. The rules around what you ethically can do as a board member are very technical and legal, but there's a different meaning of the word ethical, right? Which is to do what is right and what is fair. And I was looking for a good quote about that, and I found it in your board governance handbook, which says, be continually thinking about one's actions and decisions as a board member by considering what is legal, what is ethical, and what is fair. I love that. I mean, that pretty much says it. And so we want to think about all of these issues always broadly. I have school board members sometimes asking, is it okay if I do this? Because, technically the law says X, Y, Z. And I always come back to the basic rule. The basic principle is you don't want to do anything that could be perceived as having a conflict in the sense that you are personally benefiting, that your family is personally benefiting from your role as a board member. And when you get to those situations is when the alarms should go off and you should question, should I be involved in this particular decision? And I will just tell you my observation, city council members are much more savvy about this for some reason than school board members and members of the boards of supervisors. They recuse themselves all the time over all sorts of things. If there's any possibility. And yet I've seen school board members, thankfully not from your district, vote on things where I'm just, my brain is exploding because they should not be voting on it. And so I want to identify some of the basic principles around this and be aware when it comes to conflicts of interest. It's not just the doing what's right and fair and good. There's actual penalties from violations of California conflict of interest law. This is one of these areas where individual board members can get in trouble. So what I want to do is just point out the three main bodies of law that you have to think about when you talk about conflicts of interest. And these are discussed in our checklist that we gave you, our board member tips. And at pages 15 through 17, so at your leisure, I would actually recommend you read that part of the board member toolkit because I think it gives you a good overview of these laws. I'm going to do it much more briefly here. The first one is the Political Reform Act. And the Political Reform Act, which is a government code section 87-100 and following, if you ever want to read it, this is one where I'm going to tell you I wouldn't sit and read the whole thing because there's parts that don't apply to school boards, but read good summaries of it, at least like the toolkit we gave you. The Political Reform Act basically says that a board member shall not be financially interested in actions that the district takes. And when I say that a board member shouldn't be financially interested, remember that California is a community property state. So it's you and your spouse. It's not just you. You always have to think collectively if you have a spouse, because they have half of everything you do, including all the half of the trouble you're going to get them in if you violate these rules. So with the Political Reform Act, this is some of the parts that most of you are probably somewhat familiar with. There are gift limits in California. The gift limit went up this year. So you cannot in one 12-month period take gifts of more than $520 from somebody in relation to your role as a board member. You can receive gifts for birthdays and all those good things. But for example, if vendors want to take you to dinner, if somebody wants to buy you a large screen TV, the limit is $520, but as many of you can already sort of guess, the answer sometimes is just don't take it, just don't do it. Don't create even the impression that there's an issue there. And also be aware that if the gift is over $50, you do have to report it to the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, on your Form 700. And most of you are familiar with Form 700s. Those of you who are new to the board will become more familiar with them. These wonderful forms you have to fill out annually. I feel for you because as general counsel for some school districts, I also have to fill it out. So you have to disclose stock ownership and you have to disclose gifts that you received from, in a professional setting as a board member. And that's the big picture of the Political Reform Act. It's too complex to go into in detail here because there's just a host of rules about all the different things you have to worry about. But I wanted to just highlight really briefly just a few things to think about. For example, if you have a piece of property and that piece of property may be impacted by a decision that the district is making, that may be an issue where you want to recuse yourself, where you want to step back and not participate. If you have a situation where the board is going to be considering a contract with your child, and that child is still a dependent of yours, that can again have a financial effect on you. And so those are the kinds of issues you want to recuse yourself. The good news is recusing yourself, meaning you don't participate in any part of the decision, cures most Political Reform Act problems. You can step down and not participate. And it's interesting because you'll see in our board member toolkit, we recommend that when you recuse yourself, you leave the room. You actually are not even there during the discussion because there's all kinds of nonverbal communications that could go on, right? Other board members looking at you across the room and giving nods or whatever else. Better to leave the room. I mention that only because your board bylaws and board bylaw 9270 actually says when a board member recuses themselves, they can remain at the dais. You can stay at the front of the room. You only have to leave the dais if you want to address the board as a member of the public, and you'd stand where the members of the public stand. I leave it up to you whether you want to follow that board policy. It doesn't say you have to stay at the dais, it just says you may. And there may be circumstances where for the sake of you and your colleagues, you may want to step out of the room. So just something to consider there. There are violations of the Political Reform Act that happen. You can be fined for them up to $5,000 per violation. There was a famous brouhaha a few years back, about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, where at the California School Boards Association conference, there are a lot of vendors that take school boards out to dinners, and they're usually really nice dinners. And eventually somebody got wind of this, and the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, actually investigated it and concluded that something like 80 to 100 different school officials in Southern California, board members, superintendents, CBOs, failed to report properly that they were given those gifts or the value of those gifts, and were individually fined and basically publicly humiliated. They were in the newspapers. And then, not content to end at that, they turned to Northern California and got about 200 more school officials in Northern California. So if you're ever taken out to dinner by a vendor in your role as a school board, as a whole board or otherwise, it is appropriate to ask for a copy of the receipt so you can figure out what your portion was. And it's always, always, always okay to say, look, I want a separate bill. I'm going to pay my own way. I'm paranoid, so that's usually what I would do in most circumstances. There is good news under the Political Reform Act, which is there is a hotline you can call and actually ask the FPPC, the Fair Political Practice Commission staff, whether something is allowable or not. And that number is, I love this number because it's really easy to remember, 1-866-ASK-FPPC. 1-866-ASK-FPPC. If you're not sure, you can call them. You can also get a formal opinion from them if you need one. Yeah, Brian.
I had a couple of clarifying questions. One is, if the gift is more than the $525, but it's to be shared amongst multiple board members, does that number change?
Yeah, it should be viewed, it's $520 and you divide it by 5. So that's, I can't do the math, $100 and something each, 104.
And then the other question I had is there kind of just something you can kind of say to yourself to help you determine if something is indeed or should be classified as a gift? I mean, because we are kind of just, we're also human beings, and we kind of are, just kind of living like, how do you differentiate between, oh, Brian, I'm giving that to you because you're just really cool and I enjoy your company, versus I'm specifically giving this to you because you're on the school board.
Yeah, there's no bright line that I can give you on how to determine that. It's based entirely on the facts. So if there's a contractor in your community that you've been friends with since elementary school and you've been getting each other birthday presents for 30 years, it's probably going to be a personal present if he gives you or she gives you a present when you are on the board. If they come to you and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about the business that we do, and I'd like to take you out to this lunch so you can hear more about our services and what we can offer the district, it's going to be pretty clearly something that's being given to you in your board capacity. What I always say is, if it's in the fuzzy gray area in between, go ahead and report it. Just do it, because there's no harm in reporting it. It's just extra paperwork you have to fill out. And context is important too. If you're at a wedding and you're giving a present to somebody and that person's an elected official who's getting married, it's probably not going to be viewed as a reportable gift. It's probably going to fall into that exemption. So with all conflicts of interest issues, it's always based entirely on the facts. Everything is fact driven. And when the FPPC investigates, that's the first thing they do, is they start asking all of the questions that I'm asking now. How long have you known this person? Have you given each other presents before, et cetera?
And then my last question, sometimes we get contacted by, I believe they are pacers. Is that the right term? Maybe that's
You
not
mean the staff from the CSBA?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is a PACER. I couldn't tell you what it stands for, but a staff person from the CSBA who does outreach to individual board members.
So does that, would that also fall, or is that different because it's associated with the CSBA, or would that also fall in line with, like, your example where you were saying that just to play it safe, you will ask for your portion of the bill and pay your portion? Like, does that fall, meetings with them, does that fall into that category, or is that different because it's associated with the CSBA?
I would say it's not actually that different, because CSBA ultimately wants you to become a member and buy their products, buy their services. And so I think you treat CSBA like another vendor. My law firm, we sometimes we give away, stress balls at a conference or whatever else it is that we're giving out as a gift. We always make sure everything we give out is under $50, so you never have to worry about that. But if you're getting something you think might be worth more than $50, I'd get a receipt and consider putting it down. Clementina, you have a question.
Real quick, Harold, what about if it's not a financial gain on my part, but it's a good friend of mine since forever, and they're trying to make a deal? I mean, you know, some business, whatever, with the district. Do I have to recuse myself from a vote if it's just a friend?
Yeah, well, you know, what you're talking about is a third category of conflict of interest, which is common law conflicts of interest. And what common law conflicts of interest are is it looks inappropriate. And there's no statute on it. It means that somebody thinks what you did looks inappropriate, that it made you have a bias towards someone or something, even if it wasn't financial, they're friends, whatever that cause. And therefore you could not in an unbiased way make decisions. If that happens, somebody can actually sue you to invalidate the decision that you participated in, which harms both you and your friend, under common law conflicts of interest, which means they file a lawsuit and go to a judge, and a judge, you know, goes like this and decides which way the wind blows and decides if they think it's a conflict or not. There's no hotline to call to find out in advance. There's no clear answer on it. So I always say, if you have a close relationship with somebody who has something coming in front of the board, if possible, I usually recommend recusing yourself and just telling people, this is somebody I've known my whole life. They're a very dear friend. I have no financial interest in this. And the Political Reform Act is interested in financial interests. In this case, it's more of a, I just, to avoid any appearance of impropriety, language I really like, to avoid any appearance of impropriety, I'm going to recuse myself from this matter. I think it's the better practice. So now we've talked about the Political Reform Act. Yeah, Sarah.
I don't know if this relates, but you know, we all have kids or grandkids in the district, so we may be voting on things that would directly alter something for our own kids. And so I understand we'd be paralyzed if we recused ourselves from everything, but do you have examples of situations where there were issues that were so closely tied to someone's own interests that they either should have recused themselves, they ended up, you know, making a vote that was clearly just for their own child's interest, or cases where you've advised people or they have chosen to recuse themselves because it was too close to their own experience?
Yeah, with family members, it's always tricky. And as school board members, you frequently have board members who have kids in the district, and decisions you make are going to affect those kids. The rule under the Political Reform Act is the decision you're making uniquely affecting your child, or is it affecting a class of people who receive public services? So let me give you a very specific example. If you have a student in a district who is, for example, a special educator, they receive special education services, you can vote on service providers, you can vote on contracts to have particular programs, et cetera, because you're doing it for all special ed kids collectively. You're not just doing it for your kid, even though, you know, your kid will benefit from it. If, however, you are approving a resource specialist that's going to come in specifically to work with your child, or to work with one classroom only of high needs children that your child is in, that probably means you should be recusing yourself, because it's gone from the kind of general to the specific. The same is true, by the way, with labor negotiations. If you were married to somebody who is in the school district as an employee, you can vote them a raise if you're voting a raise for the entire class. So all classified employees, for example, are getting a raise, but you can't promote them or give them individually a raise. So the rule you always have to think about is this something that affects everybody generally? So my kid is going to rise or fall with everybody else, or is it narrowly tailored in a way that it's going to affect my family individually? It is interesting on dealing with family members. The education code says, this is Education Code 35107 subdivision E, it says you are supposed to abstain if the matter you're voting on uniquely affects a relative within the third degree by blood or affinity. So that means parent, grandparent, child, grandchild, and work your way sideways to sibling, niece, etc. So if it's going to uniquely affect a a family member, you are supposed to recuse yourself. So that's always the test is this affecting me uniquely or them uniquely? Or is it just that they are a general class of recipients of public services? And you know what my answer is going to be if you're in doubt? Recuse yourself. Always go with that, the safer route. And this is one we've struggled with board members for years about where that exact dividing line is. And at some point you have to make a decision. Do I honestly think that this is in the interest of my family only or others? I also wanted to mention while we're on the family issue, because your governance handbook has language about when your kid is in a district school. So we're moving away from the kind of rules of conflict of interest and more into the protocols that the district's adopted. It has this interesting statement in the governance handbook. It's a good statement. A board member whose child is attending a district school should be aware of his or her role as a board member when interacting with district employees about his or her child, because his or her position as a board member should inform the superintendent or designee before volunteering in his or her child's classroom. So there's where you internally tried to take care of another issue that's more of a general, not a technical legal issue, which is when board members have kids who are in a class, you have to know when you're talking to that teacher, they know you're a board member. And so you have to be very mindful, this gets back to something Clementina was getting at, to say, I'm here in my individual capacity as the parent of my child, versus I'm here as a board member evaluating you, watching you, acting as your employer. And be aware, we always say, once you put on a board member hat, you can't take it off. They're going to see you as a board member, even if you make clear you're there as a parent. One thing that I personally did, because again, I'm the general counsel for the school district in which my kids attended school for 12 years. There were issues along the way where I had an issue with a teacher or there was another problem, and I didn't get involved, my wife did. That was one way we tried to approach it, just to keep it as neat and clean as possible, because here I am, the lawyer who helps fire bad teachers, and I'm going to go talk to the teacher about a concern I have. It's not a great moment for that teacher. And it may just be a minor concern. So, but you still get to be a parent. You just have to be upfront. There's also that language in there about letting the superintendent know, board members, when they show up at school sites, can truly cause a ruckus. And I've seen this happen in district after district, because nobody knows if you're showing up there as a board member, as a parent, if you're just there for an open house, what it is that you're doing. It's really good if the superintendent knows, if they can give the principal a heads up and keep everybody informed. The story I always tell, and I think I told this to your board last year, is we had a newly elected board member, great guy, well-meaning, but he didn't quite understand the role of a board member yet. And he showed up after his election at a school site, and he put out a card table, and he put his board member plaque that he has when he goes to board meetings out on the table, and he had a copy of the education code with him. And he basically said, now open for business. Anybody wants to talk to me, you come on over, I'm on the school board. And the principal had a heart attack, because what is this board member doing on his campus? And is he there as a representative of the board? Is he there as an individual? Do I have to tell people not to talk to him? What am I supposed to do? Fortunately, principal called the superintendent called us. We all decided the best thing to do was have a conversation with him. He understood that what he did wasn't the best idea in the world. He never did it again. But those are kind of some of those issues around the family and how you deal around those questions. They're hard questions, but always go back to that issue of, is something I'm doing uniquely affecting my kid, my best friend, my niece, my parent, whatever that's going to be, versus is the decision I'm making affecting a class of people that happens to also help my kid. And we all know you make decisions along the way as a board member. You're still a parent. Those are still your kids. You still are hoping for what's best for them. You're still informed by their experience. That's okay. But you have to be mindful of the conflicts. The other, before we pass over it, the other type of conflict of interest I wanted to mention is Government Code Section 1090. This is what I refer to as the nuclear version of conflicts of interest law. Government Code Section 1090 basically says that a school board member or an elected official cannot make a contract with themselves. So you can't have the board enter into a contract with a business that you are a significant owner of, your spouse operates, et cetera. And the most famous case of this was Bill Honig, former state superintendent of schools, who famously went down in flames and ended his political career because of Government Code Section 1090. This is, he's a good guy. There was a program out there that he thought was uniquely wonderful for the state of California. He pushed through a contract to enter into business with this entity. It was the only entity offering this particular service. And his wife happened to be the head of that company and I think the owner of that company. And he was criminally prosecuted. The state superintendent of schools was criminally prosecuted, had to plead no contest, had to give up his office, had to stop being the state superintendent, had to forego the ability to ever hold public office in California again. And his wife, who actually provided the services, had to repay hundreds of thousands of dollars to the state. You cannot enter into a contract with yourself. There are exceptions. There's rules that are called remote interests or non-interests, where, for example, unless you own more than 3% of the stock in Apple, it's okay to approve a contract for the district to buy Apple computers. I'm guessing most of you don't own more than 3% of the stock in Apple because you'd be on a beach somewhere. If you are a small, again, like 3% owner of a local business that's done business with the district for over 5 years before you were elected to the board, you can recuse yourself. The contract can go through, you have to recuse yourself. The odd part is that if it's a direct 1090 conflict, you cannot recuse yourself. The board simply can't enter into the contract and the contract's void. And I'm going to give you the truest horror story I know about Section 1090 because it always sticks with me, a case called Thompson versus Call. And what happened in that case was that a city council member owned a piece of land. The city wanted that piece of land. They needed it for a particular, I think, a library or police station, something like that. And the city decided to require the developer of some local homes to provide that land, to buy that land and provide it to them in mitigation of the impact of their residential development. And so this company, then the developer, went to this city council member and said, we want to buy your property to give to the city. Well, it was pretty indirect, right? That wasn't the city entering into a contract with the city council member. It was the city requiring something of a developer who was entering into the contract with the city council member. But in the end of the day, the city council member was being enriched by what the city was requiring of this developer. And so what the city council member did was they went to the city attorney and they got an opinion. And that opinion said, yeah, it's okay, just recuse yourself. Well, the city attorney was wrong. And the court ultimately concluded that there was a violation of Government Code Section 1090, that this is where it gets really scary. The city council member had to return the entire amount of money that he'd been paid for the property, but he did not get the property back. So he was out the property, he was out the money for the property, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was removed from office and barred from holding office again. So this is why you have to be really careful. And one of the weird things about that case is it confirmed that you are not entitled to rely on the city, or in this case, the school district's legal counsel. You have to get your own attorney to advise you on Government Code Section 1090, because the case said it's not enough that you acted with good intent because your attorney said it's okay. That wasn't your attorney, that was the city's attorney. Now we give 1090 opinions all the time, but we give them with a great big caveat that says you might want to check on your own. The other thing is that since that case was decided back in 1985, I think it was, the FPPC will now also give opinions on Section 1090 issues, not just on Political Reform Act issues. So a lot of times our answer now is pick up the phone and call 1-800-ASK-FPPC, or actually 1-866-ASK-FPPC. So be really, really mindful. If you have a situation, you cannot just recuse yourself in those types of situations. The board can't enter into the contract. The contract is going to be void, and this is the punchline, you can be criminally prosecuted, just like the state superintendent of schools was. So the moral of that story is you want to be as squeaky clean on these issues as possible. And this is also a place you can help each other. Sometimes we don't see the conflict ourselves, but another board member in a non-accusatory way can say, pull you aside and say, isn't that your brother-in-law? Or didn't you used to own that business? Because sometimes it takes another voice for you to kind of click and say, oh, The special ed example I gave you, the special education, we had a board member whose kid had gotten special ed services from the district for years and never really thought about it because she'd been advised correctly that that was services they were getting generally. But when the kid got to an advanced grade level and started to need special services that were only for that one student that was part of the IEP, the voice didn't go off in her head. Wait a minute, this is now the board approving a contract that's just for my kid. That's when that bell should have gone off. Fortunately, other board members sort of said, well, wait, let's go talk to Harold, let's talk to the FDPC. We were able to navigate our way through it. But you want to stay very, very clean. Yes, Clementina.
Harold, I don't know, I know you've been talking more about the legal aspect, and I kind of wanted to ask you a question or sort of a comment about more general public service as board members. Is it an appropriate time now, or should I hold off for a minute?
We're going to get to that segment after I want to talk to you a little bit about board member liability, because this is that great moment where I get to tell you where somebody could try to take your house from you, which I think in fairness, when you're elected, you should be told what these circumstances are. You've already heard one, right? Government Code Section 1090 is an area where you can be personally liable, the Political Reform Act. But I want to give you this basic rule, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just kind of wanted to make you aware that what the government code says in California is the following. It says, except as otherwise provided by statute, a public employee is liable for injury caused by his act or omission to the same extent as a private person. Now, I know I said employee, that's been interpreted to include board members. It applies equally to school board members. So what that section says is that you can be liable for what you do as a board member unless there's a statute that says you're not liable. So what those statutes that say you're not liable are on all say the same thing, which is the district has to defend you. That means providing you with a lawyer. They have to indemnify you if you get sued, meaning they have to pay any damage that you get. They have to take care of you in all of these regards if you are acting within the scope of your duties. So if you're acting within the scope of your duties, you are protected. Conversely, if you're not acting in the scope of your duties, the district is not under an obligation to defend and indemnify you and to hold you harmless, meaning that you are not going to potentially be individually sued. I will tell you that often when people file lawsuits against school districts, they name individual board members. They'll sue Albany Unified School District, the superintendent, the CBO, and the individual board members and the board acting as a whole. If you ever see that, don't panic, because it's probably going to be the case that the district is picking up your defense, that their insurance is going to cover all of this, and that you're going to be protected. And in fact, the district is required to cover insurance or cover you with insurance and carry insurance to cover personal liability for you if you are acting within the scope of your duties. And this is echoed in your board bylaws, which talk about that the Board of Education is going to, what it says is the Board of Education shall provide insurance necessary to protect board members and employees while acting within the scope of their office or acting within the scope of their employment in accordance with Education Code Section 35208. It goes on to say no board member shall be liable for harm caused by his or her or act or omission when acting within the scope of district responsibilities. Conversely, your handbook also says that these protections don't apply if the board member acted with willful or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, recklessness, or a conscious flagrant indifference to the harmed person's right to safety. So I'm going to translate all of that for you to tell you what the bottom line is. Remember the example of the board member who showed up with the card table and said, I'm open for business now at the school site. Nobody knew he was going. The board did not authorize him to do that. He was doing it on his own. If pulling into the parking lot, goodness forbid, he ran over somebody's foot, he ran over the principal's foot, he could be potentially personally liable, and the district would have been under no obligation to provide him a lawyer, to defend him, or to pay any damages. If, however, he was sent to that school site at the direction of the school board to attend a particular event as the school board representative, and he ran over the principal's foot in the parking lot on the way there, he almost certainly would have had the district defend, indemnify, and hold him harmless and protect him in these regards. That's why it's really important when you go out in the community, when you are acting in your role as a board member, you really have a solid understanding. I'm acting in my role as a board member. If nobody in the district knows you're doing something, you're probably not acting in your role as a board member. It's something the board was discussed, the board president's aware of, the superintendent's aware of. If you were tasked with it, you're probably protected. And this is a really important thing that board members don't get told about. So you're now one of the few groups in California, because nobody seems to want to talk about this with school board members, that knows, just always make sure. And I've had board members when I've done this presentation for them, they get very good about asking the question, I'm gonna go attend this. Is that okay? Is that all right? Board president, can I go do this on behalf of the board? Or board, is it all right with everybody if I go attend this? Or superintendent, I want to let you know, because I'm on this committee for the board, I'm going to be going to this event. Those are really important conversations to have, because I don't want any of you to lose your houses, to have to hire lawyers. Melissa, you have an unfair advantage because you already are one, but for the others, it's something that you really want to be careful with. There are other potential areas of board liability. They're long enough of list. I'm not going to tell you about, most of them will never come up, but just 3 really quickly to make you aware of. Under California law, if the district makes an improper expenditure and the board knowingly approved that, the individual board members can be liable. That's a pretty extreme case. You're talking about basically you're cooperating with somebody's theft from the district, for example. So if Dr. Wells comes to you next week and says he wants a raise to make $1.5 million a month and you approve it, that doesn't pass the straight face test. I'm sorry, Frank. And you probably engaged in this type of activity for which you could be personally liable. 2 other areas, if you release information from closed session for pecuniary gain, that means some financial advantage to you, you can be personally liable for that. And the last one I'll mention here, and it does come up from time to time, is the Field Act. California has something called the Field Act that says all of your buildings have to be earthquake compliant. You have to build them to appropriate state standards and approval to the state. If the board knowingly places students in a building that it knows not to be Field Act compliant, and there's an earthquake and students are injured as a result, you can be personally liable. So how do you protect yourself in that case? Whenever you hear about the district putting kids into a building that was not built by the district, it's a really good idea to ask the question, is this a Field Act compliant building? That's a conversation we have a lot with charter schools, where the law is a lot less clear about how the Field Act does or doesn't apply. But we, for example, had a situation where a school burned. It was overnight. The district had to figure out where to put kids, and they started talking about placing them in a local community center. And I'd say, wait, is that local community center Field Act compliant? Because if it's not, and the board is knowingly approving putting kids there to deal with this emergency, that could actually be a problem for you. So what that district ended up doing, it was fortunately it was spring and it was pretty warm, was they actually rented a circus tent. I kid you not. And the kids finished the school year under a circus tent rented from Cirque du Soleil. I've seen everything over the years, but that was that moment as a board member, you should be thinking, oh, is it okay to put kids in that setting? So I know I quickly went through that, and I wanted to kind of just generally address that. But what I really want to spend the rest of, I know we have limited time on, is to get back to Clementina's question and talk about a little bit about how the board communicates and operates with the community, with staff, and when it is your personal opinion versus the board's opinion and how you represent that. The key thing to know is that your board bylaws in section 9005, this is true for most school districts, states that authority rests with the board as a whole and not with individuals. You are not, as an individual board member, authorized to command the services of district staff. You are not, as an individual board member, authorized to speak on behalf of the district unless the board authorized you to do that. You always operate as one of 5. And how do you do that? That's a hard thing to do. And when you look at your board bylaw, again, 9005, which is a good one to read, it talks about the board members assuming collective responsibility for building unity and creating a positive organizational culture, and having a unity of purpose. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to agree with each other. It's actually healthy if you don't always agree with each other. I worry about school boards where every vote is a 3-2 vote, and I worry about school boards where every vote is a 5-0 vote. It's okay to disagree. It's okay not necessarily to vote the same way. I think the litmus test of a good board, an effective board, and a high-performing board is what happens after that vote. And that's really how you judge yourself. If, let's say you have a 3-2 split. After that vote, do the two who were in the minority on that vote go around and tell people, well, the board blew it on that one, I voted against it? Or do they go out and they say, well, I voted my conscience, I was opposed to it, but now it's the district's policy and we're going to do our best to make it work? Or give an answer which I love, which is, the vote was already taken. If you want to go watch the recording of the meeting, you'll see what my opinion was. But now we've made a decision and we're moving forward, and I'm with it. And the example I use here is an actual example from a school district where they had a school board member who was very passionate about math. That was, I think she was a math major and it was just sort of her passion. And the district was looking at adopting a new math curriculum. They had a committee that went through and developed the math curriculum. The heads of the math department were involved with it. Community members were. Everybody was happy with it. They brought it to the board and this board member didn't like it. She thought they could do better. And it got to be rough because there was all of this community input into it and she was basically saying no. And the meeting was going ugly and kind of going sideways a little bit. And then the board president, who was a very skilled board member, had been on the board for a long time, said, how about this? What if we vote for this curriculum? What if we, because it was clear it was going to be a 4-1 vote with a divided board. What if we vote to approve this and agree that in a year we will come back with specific metrics to see if it's working or not? Why don't we cooperate that way? And wouldn't you know it, it was a 5-0 vote, which was a great moment of boardsmanship. It was important for the community to be heard and understand that the board was behind this curriculum. The unanimous vote on that was important. And also a year later, they came back with specific metrics. And I happened to be at that meeting where the board member who was going to vote no basically said, this worked. You know, all of my fears were disproven, it worked. And so there was the opportunity to do that. But what I also saw was a commitment by the other 4 board members that if it didn't work, they would honestly revisit and reconsider what this board member had originally proposed. So that question of what the 2 board members do who are in the minority is really important, but it's also important what the 3 board members in the majority do. You know, do they go out and say, well, we've defeated the enemy? Or do they go out and say, well, we're working together and we've heard what the concerns were of the dissenters and we're going to keep those in mind? The example I use here was the worst groundbreaking for a new school I ever attended in my life, where there was a board member who was opposed to building a school at that particular location. And he was a minority of 1. And over the years worked his way up to become a school board member, a school board president. And at the groundbreaking gave the speech, and at the speech led off by saying, well, you all know I didn't think this was the right site for the school. And I kept waiting for him to say, but I've come around and look how beautiful it is. And this is going to be an amazing opportunity. And he didn't. He doubled down and just said again, I really wish that we had not picked this site. And the newspapers and the parents and the students were just sitting there shaking their heads. They had no idea what was happening. And you know, frankly, the superintendent kind of took the mic and took over and gave a very uplifting speech, thankfully. There's those examples of you speak with one voice. You have to find the way to disagree agreeably, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to put it. I always remind people that she and Scalia disagreed on every case you can imagine in front of the United States Supreme Court, but they also used to go to opera together and were great family friends. You have to find your way to that path. And to get back to something that Clementina asked about, so now you're a board member and people in the community are asking you, well, what's your position on this? Really tough question, right? Because we just talked about you operate with unity, you operate with a common vision, you operate as a group of 5, which is why it's really important to clarify to people, are you speaking as an individual? Are you speaking as on behalf of the board? It's okay to tell your constituents, you know, yeah, I personally am opposed to a plan to do X. But once the vote's taken by the board, that has to change to, you know, I stated my concerns about it, but this is the position the board took, and we're going to work on it to try to make it work. I know everything I'm saying sounds just like what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, where everybody's getting along famously. I honestly believe those that are saying that it's too late for Washington, D.C. We've got to reform at the local level first to learn how to work in a, bilateral, bicameral, across the aisle way with one another, even when we don't agree. And I believe that firmly, that it's up to us to do that locally, so that hopefully it spreads to the state. So hopefully it gets back to the federal level, because right now it's not at the federal level. It's rather broken. I don't know. I haven't heard tonight if there are riots in DC or not, but I won't be surprised if there are, because of the nerve of some people that they actually elected a president. And so we try to model our behavior at the local level. And it's interesting. I'm looking at some of the board bylaw language, Clementina. It gets back to your question. And you have a board bylaw 9010 that says, when speaking to community groups, the media, or other members of the public, individual board members should recognize that their statements may be perceived as reflecting the views and positions of the board. Board members have a responsibility to identify personal viewpoints as such and not as the viewpoint of the board. So you actually have a policy that says you're supposed to make clear to people, this is my opinion versus the board's opinion. And the answer I always love on that is back to, if you want to hear what I have to say if you want to hear my opinion, if you want to hear what the board has to say, come to the board meeting. Rather than me pontificating about how I'm going to vote. That's, I think, just great board practice to say, come to the board meeting. We're going to have a lively discussion there. You'll get to hear everything I have to think about the subject. But all of that said, it doesn't mean you can't talk to your constituents. You can't talk to your neighbors. You can't tell people what your feelings are. That you didn't give that up when you were elected to the board. You just have to identify, are you speaking as an individual or not? And in fact, in that same board bylaw, it says that responses to the public or press will be prefaced with, and it gives a quote, I am speaking as an individual and not for the Board of Education. My comments are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the other board members or of the Albany Unified School District. Now, do I think you have to say it that formally? Not necessarily, but that message, it's cooked into your operating procedures. And be aware too, something to be on the lookout for. People in the community will respect your authority, but they will come to you because they want things fixed. They will come to you because they want to talk to you about the thing they're unhappy about. And your board bylaws also make clear, actually it's your board governance handbook, your job is not to fix the problem. Your job is to listen and to report to the appropriate person at the district, which is often going to be the superintendent. And by the way, your board handbook and board policies also make clear when you need to go to staff, you're supposed to go through the superintendent and not go directly to the staff member. The reason for that is so that, again, the staff member doesn't know if you're coming to them on behalf of the board, as an individual, how that works. And so you have that also cooked into your policies and into your bylaws in a really healthy way. Dr. Wells said it when we were preparing for this session with the board president. At the end of the day, it's the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated, and listen to the members of the community, make them feel respected. Also be aware that if somebody comes to you with a fix, to fix something for them, and they really start going into detail on what they want, the further into that you go with them, the more likelihood you may have to recuse yourself when the board actually does something about it, because you've now inserted yourself as a witness. You are now part of the process rather than part of the solution. And so you, again, very mindful to listen respectfully, refer people, let them know that you referred the matter to the superintendent. And also be aware that the district has various uniform complaint procedures that apply to different kinds of complaints that have specific steps to be followed. And if you go in and start trying to fix it yourself, you may actually be violating the uniform complaint procedures for how different kinds of complaints are processed. And consistent with that theme, the last thing I really wanted to point out on all of this is it's not just a matter of working with the public and listening to them, it's working with your staff as well. And we could do another 3-hour session and just talk about the board staff team and how they work together. And that's a great topic for another day. But I wanted to make you aware as well that golden rule that the superintendent talked about applies as well for when you're dealing with staff. Remember that they are probably overworked, overburdened, and have not slept enough, that it's useful for you to get information from them, but it's also important for you to have the moments of separating the wheat from the chaff, or as I like to think of it, do I need this information or do I want this information? Need this information is I can't vote on this matter without this information. The like to have, the want to have, you've got to keep in mind the burdens on the superintendent. You can do the math. If each of you ask the superintendent 2 things a day for 2 pieces of information a day, right? You're responsible for 10 a week. 5 board members, that's 50 requests a week. That's 200 requests a month. That's 2,400 requests a year. It's a tremendous amount of time. If each of those requests take an hour, your superintendent's spending 2,400 hours answering your questions and not doing their job as the superintendent. So you do need to be mindful about that. And again, your board governance handbook gets into this. It says board members should be sensitive to the workload of staff and as to whether their requests are necessary for effective decision-making and to further the goals of the district. And it's also the job of staff per your handbook to ask you that question. So when you ask for information, if staff asks you back, is this a want to or a need to know? That's an appropriate question for them so they can prioritize getting you the information. And the board governance handbook talks about self-monitoring. The board members are supposed to self-monitor themselves in asking for this information. You even have a process in your board governance handbook. If you go to the superintendent for information and the superintendent doesn't think reasonably that you need the information, that it's critical to get, that it's not time sensitive, et cetera, the matter is supposed to go to the board president and they're supposed to weigh in. And if the board president agrees with the superintendent, no, you don't need that. It's going to take 40 hours to put it together and it's just not reasonable. If that board member disagrees, then the question is put to the whole board. Should this information be put together and shared? Which I like that you actually have a process. And I know we worked on that process somewhat last year to get through that. And then lastly, again, your handbook does say board members should always direct requests to the superintendent and ask other staff members for information only if directed to by the board or the superintendent. And the reason, again, is to avoid overburdening the other staff members. I know one story pops to mind of a board member who was a new board member and went directly to the principal of a school with a concern that they had. And the principal freaked out because they figured this board member was there on behalf of the board and they had no warning it was coming whatsoever. Well, it was just one board member sharing their opinion. And the board member didn't preface it with this is just my opinion. Really what should have happened is that issue should have gone to the superintendent and be worked through to the principal in that way. I know that we are just about at the end of my time and probably about 5 minutes over of it. I'm happy to stick around for questions, Sarah, if you think there's time for that. And I just saw a very cute face pop up on Veronica's side. Is that Pikachu that we're seeing? No, that's great.
We definitely can take time for questions.
Good.
Yeah.
I know I hit you with a lot of information.
I just wanted to say, Harold, that I'm glad you provided all this legal, financial, scary stories to our 2 board members after they came on board and not before those important elections. But they're very important information for all of us.
Yeah, I remember hearing it the first time, and I think when it was presented to us more as you're covered as a lot, and you are definitely going to do it all right and always act within the parameters of your job and don't worry about it. But it's good to be reminded that sometimes we need help knowing when we're about to do something wrong. Brian, did you want to ask a question? Or you're waving at our guest?
I was just waving at our company there.
Sorry, I know it, but this is easier than having them yelling.
No, that's why we're all here. So I love when they come on the camera. That's great.
They're fascinated. I was telling them who everybody is, so they're all very interested in who's on the screen and what everybody's doing, so that they can kind of figure it out. Yep.
Who's their favorite?
Oh, we don't pick favorites. We like everybody.
Well, no, I think we did. Sarah's kids said I'm their favorite. They told me.
I had one quick question,
It's
Sarah.
because
you know,
they
I
won the
noticed-
basketball pool. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I had one quick question. You know, Sarah and I are, and I don't know if anyone else is, this isn't even a social media closed group, but we're in an email list where there's like a chain of comments, and there's a school related issue that comes up on those. And I've been very careful not to reply or anything. Is that's covered? Like if we just see it and it comes to us, but now that we know that we're both on the same email list and it is relating to that, is that something we should be careful of or aware of?
No, it's a good question. As I read the new law, as long as you are being a passive recipient of that information, you're not actively involved in the chain, you're not responding, you're okay. And that's a good thing about the new law, because a year ago, I couldn't tell you definitively that that's the case. And so I think you're fine on that. As long as, again, you're just the passive recipient, it shouldn't be too much of a problem.
I just wanted to comment very quickly that, Harold, you really clarified a lot, I think, in terms of one of the protections that we have, and also one of the most effective ways, and really the good practice ways, is to work with the superintendent. That as individual board members, we may have some great ideas and lots of things I want to get done, but I really need to go through the superintendent first and last, because you know, because there are protocols, and like you've said many times, principals will get nervous, upset. Why are board members knocking on my door when I'm not prepared for that? You know, and so to me tonight, you really reminded me of a really key issue, which is always working with the superintendent so that he, first of all, knows, and then we can go from there, you know, next steps. But that's really key for all of us board members. So thank you for that highlight.
So if there aren't other questions, we can move to our last two brief items. I don't know if, Harold, you don't need to stick around for these if you're ready to move on with your evening, or you're welcome to. We're only going to be here for 15 more minutes, so great. So I'm going to share my screen, I hope. Are you able to see something on effective board meetings?
Yes, can you just
Yes.
have a larger, can you enlarge it a little bit?
That's a very good question. Can I?
Yeah,
Is
you
that
can.
bigger?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So when Clementina and I first put together this agenda, we thought, oh, well, we could spend some time talking more about effective board meetings, and then thought, well, maybe we should give the new board members a chance to actually sit through several more board meetings before we ask them to help us try to improve them. So instead of having a full discussion tonight about which would be picking up on an earlier discussion that I will summarize, we just wanted to sort of bring the two new members up to speed about discussion that we had, I don't remember when this was, November, October, about how to make our meetings more effective. And this discussion was really originated by President Trutain and Superintendent Wells. And I think Superintendent Wells is very eager for us to continue to improve in this area. And the, excuse me, the concerns that were coming up repeatedly were really that we were ending very late, meetings were being extended repeatedly, and it wasn't making for good decision making. So what we are considering a sort of effective meeting, or within the purview of this conversation about making our meetings more effective, are that everyone is prepared, that the board reads the agenda and the materials in advance and gives questions, that the staff are prepared, that materials that are going to be presented in the meeting are really available far enough in advance for both the board and the public to review them. And we've had some glitches in that, and we've had some conversations about how to make sure that that really happens, so that everyone has a chance to digest everything quite a bit before the meeting. And that ties into another sort of shared rule that we have of not having surprises during the meeting, so that the board asks clarifying questions in advance to the extent possible, that materials aren't sprung on us during the meeting, and that generally the goal, sort of feeding into what Harold said about how we relate to the staff, that our goal as board members is to be cognizant of maintaining a good relationship with staff and not sort of putting them on the spot if we can avoid doing that. Obviously, we follow our meeting norms and the governance handbook. We overhauled the meeting norms last spring, I think, with Harold's help. And we also revised some aspects of the governance handbook. So working through those will be helpful before we reconvene to talk about this. As Harold mentioned, these are board meetings that happen in public. So for our meetings to be effective, the board needs to be able to get through all of its business, everything that's on the agenda, within a reasonable time. And the reasonable time part is both so that we're still making good decisions. I don't make very good decisions after 10 p.m. A lot of people don't. It's very hard for the public to participate in a 5 or 6 hour meeting. So we and Superintendent Wells has been very adamant that we've got to figure out how to keep our meetings on track in order to be an effective governance team. So last October, November, I don't know, time is all relative these days. We had a discussion, we had some breakout groups, and we came up with some possible strategies for improving our board meetings. The two that we actually approved were that we can only extend the meetings 2 times, again, has to be voted on by a majority, and that each extension can be for an hour. So this sounds like it's not doing much because it still allows us to extend our meetings by 2 hours, but believe it or not, we've had many, many meetings run multiple hours beyond when they were supposed to. And then the second change we made was just to sort of arrange our agenda items to make sure that students can go home first if they're giving a presentation or participating in an item in some way, and then staff, meaning teaching staff and other support staff, and then our district office staff who usually have to stay for the whole thing anyway. So you'll see us try to construct the agendas in that way, or at times we may rearrange things during the meeting in order to allow people to go home who, for whatever reason, we would like for them to be able to go home. The other 2 ideas that came up, but that we didn't have a resolution on, were one that we really have board members either we impose, specify, or we self-regulate how much time we take up in a meeting speaking. So there are boards that have done this. They allow board members to only comment twice on a given item or for a certain number of minutes on a given item, sort of to allow board members to express the rationale behind their vote, for example, but that once we're at a point where we can move toward a vote, that's the sort of purpose of the meeting. So we discussed that, but we didn't come to a conclusion about it. And then the second was we just talked about the extent to which it's public comment that is making the meetings much longer than they're scheduled for. And how do we deal with that? How do we balance wanting to hear from the public, but also recognizing that at some point it's up to the board to make a decision about an item, and that in order to do that effectively, we have to limit public comment. So those are the two things that we did not come to a resolution on. There may be other strategies. The new board members may have other ideas, either from observing us already, or as you have more meetings and you get a sense of what it is that takes us so long. But rather than decide how to resolve this now, we wanted to present sort of what we've done so far, and then we can bring this back in a couple of months and see what else we want to do as a board. So if you have comments or questions about this now, we can talk about them. Otherwise, our next item would be to talk about what are the things we want to schedule as workshops, trainings, workshops, discussions over the rest of this school year or for the next 12 months, so that we can start working those and planning for those and working them into the agenda. But I want to ask first, especially for Melissa or Veronica, if there's anything you want to comment on specifically about the effectiveness of board meetings, or questions about preparation or expectations, or anything in that arena that you want to ask tonight, or we can build them into a future conversation.
I don't have anything to ask or to add right now. I don't think, nothing to ask, and just thinking about length of meetings or how they run. It's helpful. I appreciate having that set out, like what the sort of guidelines are that you've come up with, what the things are that you recently approved. And, you know, sometimes even if it was sort of clear, oh, they seem to be prioritizing this, they seem to be, you know, it's nice to just have it sort of clearly set out what the sort of stated priorities and goals were. But yes, I think having a few more board meetings under my belt will be helpful to comment.
Great.
I agree with, I'm just going to say I agree with Melissa, and it was really helpful today. Julie gave me kind of the breakdown of when we should receive things and when we can get our questions in by, to give the district staff and the superintendent time to respond to us so that we can process it. So it was really helpful to know that in advance, so I'm not springing anything the other way on them or not having time to actually read a response. But I'll know, I've watched a lot of board meetings, but I think I'll get more for the feel on the inside with a couple more of these.
Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't like the idea of limiting how much or how long board members can speak, only because it is the board's meeting. I mean, it's our meeting, and I know, like, I understand limiting the public from speaking and kind of limiting their time. But I don't really like the idea of limiting the board members and their time, or saying that they can only speak twice on an item, only because if a board member has like additional thoughts after they speak 2 times, I think it's important for us to hear from them and for them to not be limited because they can only speak 2 times, because it's our meeting, and we have to eventually like make a decision about whatever that topic is. And they're usually really big and important topics that affect the entire, you know, district that we're governing over. So I don't like the idea of being limited, especially since I feel like it limiting the board members, it caters to everyone else, and it's not their meeting. And I feel like it's important to kind of remind ourselves of that, you know, as we have these discussions, that, you know, we, as Harold pointed out, we are required to have these meetings in public by law. If that wasn't a requirement, we would just be sitting in a boardroom as board members, and we would be meeting. And I don't know if at other companies, if you've talked twice, you can't. I don't know if they do. I mean, yeah, I understand, like, in the interest of time, but the topics that we tackle are sometimes we have to kind of think about stuff, and then as you're kind of listening to other people talk, like other things pop in your head, or you start to figure things out, or you're taking notes, and so I don't really like the idea. I'm hoping maybe we can take that out as we talk about it later. Thanks.
Yeah, just to be clear, so those last two were not things that they were things that were proposed by somebody at some point in that previous discussion. So I'm just showing them so people know the conversation we've had. We're not making any kind of decision tonight about what to do. I think for one thing, not only have the two board members not had their own experience being in a board, but I think every 5 people function differently than another group of 5 people, right? So I think it'll take us some time to figure out our own dynamics that might lead us to produce a different set of proposals, right? Depending on how we interact with each other. Clementina.
I've decided to save time for tonight and not speak to that issue, because I certainly have an opinion on that, but I think that Melissa and Veronica, with time, they'll have a better idea of what we're talking about in terms of, how much time we really need to make good decisions, effective decisions. So I'll just hold off my personal comments until when we have a further discussion on this item.
Great. So we have a couple of minutes left. We just wanted to talk through or give people a chance to voice ideas for future workshops or trainings. This is not, we can talk about this at the end of any board meeting. But I wanted to let folks know we do still have a second workshop that we've already sort of paid for from our equity consultant, Nicole Anderson, who's the same person who's been working with the city. So one thing we have to decide as a board is how we want to use that workshop. We will need to do some board strategic planning at some point this spring, as well as a superintendent evaluation discussion. And that's sort of all that we have scheduled, but I wanted to give people a chance to say, not other board agenda items, but sort of workshops, trainings, other things like this that you can think of now that we might need, or we can, they can always be brought up later too. Or Harold, if there are ideas you have for other types of trainings you do after this one for folks.
Can I jump in, Sarah? Because I have a list of items. And I just want to throw out the superintendent evaluation is so important. That's really one of the numero uno responsibilities of the board. And along with that, I would like to throw in that we really look at a board evaluation. We've spent a lot of time tonight talking about being effective and how to do that. And so board evaluations, and I think we need a workshop on it, or really revisiting what we put together last year. I think both of the new board members also participated when there was a presentation, I believe in December, about math at the high school. That's a huge issue, and we barely touch the surfaces. I would like it to be a board workshop sometime, so we could really, dive deeper into that at the high school. I have lots of others, but I'll just mention those two tonight, and maybe share with the president and with the superintendent, so that they can kind of see, where they could fit in.
Veronica.
I would love to just second. That's the first thing that caught my eye, was the math at the high school, and maybe even the middle school. I know hasn't been brought up yet, but just if it's a package of our upper level schools, I would love to take some time to dive deeper in that.
Brian, is that your hand from before? Or...
Oh, no, that's my hand from from this topic. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'd like for us to do an in-depth workshop on the budget.
Great. Any other thoughts? That's certainly enough to keep us busy for a while. And someday we'll be able to do them in person. Great, and we will bring back this, perhaps in our board, in the context of a board evaluation, we can bring back the meetings as a piece of that to see how well we're doing with at least cutting ourselves to 2 hours of extra time. All right, so thank you very much, Harold, for that overview. And one advantage to doing this is it's recorded, so we can all go back and watch it again. That's a great resource for us. And thank you, Superintendent Wells, for helping to organize this and for listening to all of us. And all the staff who've also been sitting here patiently. We will see everyone next Tuesday at our regular board meeting. And this meeting is adjourned.
Night,
Thanks.
everybody.
All right, we went through a whole meeting and we didn't hear from our superintendent the entire time.
I know.
I can't believe it.
I know.
Be careful what you ask for.
It was
He
really,
has 2 ears. He is listening to every word we say. He is the best listener I know.
it was really nice.
All right, everyone, go watch the election returns. That's my secret
Yeah.
advice for you all.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you, Julie.